Orders of the day, order du jour.
Government Bills Commons, resuming debate at second reading on Bill C-52, Fair Rail and Freight Service Act.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-la-Chine.
First of all, I must say that I have mixed feeling about BC C-52. This is difficult because I want to encourage our rail services and I support this bill. But there are significant gaps not addressed by this bill that absolutely need to be brought forward. In committee, we will try to make some needed improvements to this bill. My colleague from Trinity Spadina consulted several experts, including exporters, and many of them brought up the issue of price. Absent from Bill C-52 is the important and unregulated discrepancy in rail fees, for example, between CP and CN. Why are existing discrepancies not addressed in this bill? Rail freight transportation must be more efficient and effective. It needs to provide reliable and sustainable services. Unregulated rail fees are not aspect to look into, and this can be done at committee. Mr. Speaker, trains move goods and people. Trains are a key mode of transportation for Canadians in the 21st century. I myself try to travel between my riding on Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-la-Chine and Ottawa by train as much as possible. Rail freight transportation provides a service to our Canadian farmers and producers who ship their goods to market by train. This mode of transportation is essential to Canada's economic development, but does it currently benefit our farmer, producers, and our Canadian Shippers Association as much as it benefits to CN and CP? Does it benefit public transportation as much as it supports commercial interest? A look at balance sheets and recent decisions at CP and CN shows that these companies are run for their shareholders, not for users of public transportation or small family businesses that rely on rail freight transportation. Mr. Speaker, this decision was a choice made to service shareholders and profits over customers. As we've seen this before, my colleagues know that this can lead to poor quality services. The Coalition of Rail Shippers has been stating for years that they receive poor quality services from CN and CP because of this pricing issue, and they are priority clients. Listen to the private shippers, and they will tell you that CN dictates the market. CN is the largest player in Canadian rail freight transportation. According to a reply by the Coalition of Rail Shippers, presented at the Canadian Maritime Conference in 2010, CN and CP together control 94% of the market by revenue. Mr. Speaker, this market lacks competition, innovation, and regulation. This is not the way to support Canada's economy or to encourage Canadian success. I think it is important that Bill C-52 gives freight shippers the right to enter into service agreements with railway companies and establish an arbitration process in the event of a dispute. This is what freight shippers told us that they need. Rail shipping is the backbone of the Canadian economy. Transport Canada estimates that over 70% of all goods shipped over land go by train. The reason is easy to understand. In our very big country, rail shipping is often the bulk, and it will be difficult to ship these large quantities by truck. And shipping by boat, which is sometimes more economical, is unavailable everywhere for obvious reasons. Canada was built by train, and the railway is a vital link between faraway communities on a vast land. And I would like to talk about an activity that I did in my riding. I organized a screening with a movie called Rocky Mountain Express, who is based in my riding. And we were about 100 people looking at this wonderful movie, talking about all the history of train in Canada and how was it built in the west of Canada, and that was very amazing. And it's really showed us how our country was based on this rail train. So we might be surprised by the poor quality of rail shipping services in Canada right now. The Conservative government is not the only one responsible for this situation, but it is guilty of inaction in this file. Day in and day out, the Conservative government claims to work for the Canadian economy, but Canadian businesses are suffering from this unreliable service, the result of which hundreds of millions of dollars in economy losses every year. This affects a broad range of industry, especially agriculture, forestry, and mining. The Rail Freight Service Review found that 80% of rail shippers are dissatisfied with the services provided by rail carriers. This is 80% of loyal customers. Unreliable service at high prices continue to hurt rail customers. As I said earlier, this issue is not addressed in Bill C-52. We, the official opposition, will continue to push for fair pricing for all shippers, prices that are in line with the services received from carriers. That is something we do not see in Bill C-52, when it says that agreements governed by the new law will be made only with new customers, new contracts. And so anyone who has been using the services for years and who is a long-standing loyal customer will not have access to the same rules that Bill C-52 seeks to put in place. Clearly, this is room for improvement. We could make these improvements in committee if the government will be open enough to come to the table and participate in meaningful discussions and listen to the best suggestion to get the best bill possible. I would like to come back of the fact that 80% of customers are dissatisfied. Something had to be done, and something still urgently needs to be done. But the Conservatives' inaction has been going on for years. Why have the Conservatives taken so long to do something? Here is what I think may be happening. First, rail freight customers are often farmers or mining companies. These customers have to deal with large railways that have a virtual monopoly over rail transport. In most regions of the country, shippers cannot choose a rail transportation company because they have access to only one or the other. Even in cases where the two railway companies are present, the competition struggles to play the role it should and to influence the basic economy principle of supply and demand. Why do we need to intervene now and legislate? Why can the parties involved not come to an agreement themselves? In all likelihood, CN and CP benefit from the tacit support of the Conservative government, and in that context, they are not at all prepared to make real concessions. The result is that rail freight customers, shippers, are not satisfied with rail freight services. So, of course, they have asked the government to take action and to introduce legislation that will require CN and CP to reach agreements on the level of service provided to shippers. After years of empty words, the Conservatives are not being forced to act as a result of pressure from shipping community and the NDP. Under duress, the Conservatives finally introduced a bill designed to solve some of these problems after the NDP critics' bill was introduced last spring. That bill, which was entitled the Rail Customer Protection Act, was much clearer and covered all customers. The government is using half measures. Here are some reasons. A. The protective measures do not cover existing contracts between shippers and rail transportation companies. B. The bill offers only a limited arbitration process for unsuccessful negotiations of new contracts. C. The arbitration is available only for shippers who are negotiating new contracts instead of providing fast and reliable help for the shippers. And D. Bill C-52 will cover only new service level agreements, not those that already exist. Furthermore, the fines mentioned in Bill C-52 will go to the government and not to the shippers. We could talk all day about the amount of these fines, which seems a bit weak to me for such big companies. The ability to interact, discuss, and negotiate is undermined when the fines go into government's pocket, which supports what I was saying earlier, that CN and CP probably feel like the Conservative government in their corner. The Conservatives simply do not give Canada's rail network the attention it deserves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de
Honourable Member for Compton Stansted. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to commend my colleague for her excellent speech and also for having had the guts and the courage to give this speech in English because it is not her mother tongue. The question I would like to put to her is, well, our arbitration is not open or not available in all situations, and this bill, although it is a step in the right direction, under this bill, arbitration should be more flexible without all the rules around it. So wouldn't it have been easier to impose a simple arbitration in any conflictual or legal situation? The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame de Grace-la-Chine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his question. As I said at the beginning, this is a bill that we are going to support. It was based on the bill that my colleague from Trinity Spadina tabled in the spring, but I can't say it enough. There are many things lacking in this bill, especially arbitration measures, and I hope that we'll be able to solve that in committee. Questions and comments? Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the speech given by my colleague. This bill is something on which that has been worked on for a long time, and the NDP is calling for improvements with regard to contracts for rail transport of cargo, of freight rather, or whether it be public transit, passenger trains. So all this is very important, especially for the forest industry in Chapleau and Kapuskasing and Espanola. This is a service that they rely on very heavily. And so we appreciate the fact that there are still railways in those communities. Can my colleague explain to us a bit more how this bill will better help industries, especially the forest industry? Thank you. The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame de Grace-la-Chine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for the question. As I said, indeed, railways are essential in our country with regard to the forest industry, mines, agriculture, and this bill will help these industries with regard to supply and demand. Canada is one of the only countries that has decided to put freight transport before passenger transit, and I think that we'll have to look at that because in such a vast country, there are places that we can't even get to by truck. For example, in Northern Ontario, the only way to get there in some cases is by train, so this bill will help in that regard. It will allow shippers, those who sign freight contracts, to have better discussions with CN and CP, who control 94% of rail revenues in Canada. Thank you.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Louis Hébert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for her speech. I share her disappointment, especially when we consider that the train was one of the founding elements of our country. It is a mode of transport that has lost a lot of its glory. So I would like the member to share with this House her vision of transport in the 21st century. And this will also tell us what this bill does with regard to our expectations. The Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his question. As I mentioned, Sometimes I use my car, but I try to take the train as much as possible between my riding and Ottawa. It takes about 15 minutes more than the car, so it's a train that is much more customer friendly. I get on the train, and unfortunately I have 4 seats to myself because there is no one sitting around me, so we need to promote this mode of transport. We need to promote high-speed trains. But what is important is that train service is very expensive right now. There is a monopoly between by these two companies, and we want to improve service for everyone. Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, in the current context of free trade, that is a global free market with fierce competition, in fact, we hardly talk about globalization anymore today. It is essential to develop a healthy trade environment conducive to the establishment of a modern, flexible, solid, and reliable infrastructure. Train transport in Canada makes up a large part of the economy. It contributes over 70% to the Canadian economy. There are more carriages there are more trucks on the road, but close to 70% of our freight is transported in Canada by rail. So it is essential that those services in Canada must be advantageous both for the shippers and the companies. The cost of rail services will harm Canadian shippers. You know, the bill also excludes the questions of rates, therefore ignoring certain claims from shipper communities. As I said at the outset, in a free and very competitive market, we're talking about this link here, this link that is freight rail, is extremely important in the development of our economic strategy, and especially for the prosperity of certain regions of Canada and Quebec. But today, we are going to support this bill, and nonetheless, at second reading. The bill amends the Canada Transportation Act to require a railway company on a shipper's request to make the shipper an offer to enter into a contract respecting the manner in which the railway company must fulfill its service obligations to the shipper. It also creates an arbitration process that is quite complicated to establish the terms of such a contract if the shipper and the railway company are unable to agree on them. And that was the gist of my question, the question that I put to my colleague earlier, and perhaps it wasn't very clear, but when you're in the arbitration phase of a dispute, obviously there are things that did not function earlier during negotiations. So that means that there is a dispute, and often there's a winner and a loser. The win-win formula, when you're talking about a multinational against a small shipper or a small business, we almost never see that. So it would have been a good idea to have seen other options whereby negotiations between the parties would be facilitated. The bill also amends provisions related to air transportation to streamline internal processes and certain administrative provisions of that act, which are still, allow me to say, very complex. When you want to improve a situation and foster a sector of the economy, it's a good idea to make things easier. Now, when you look at the short title of this bill, the Fair Rail Freight Service Act, well, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. The wording paves the way to certain loopholes, especially when you think about this government's track record, which is more for the big guys and less for the little guys. The Canada Transportation Act is a framework act governing a certain number of air transport and rail markets dating from 1996. It lays out the national transit strategy by establishing free competition between carriers and different modes of transport. Now, if you live in a remote area of Canada and you have no choice but to use this mode of transport, well, that means that shippers have to either negotiate with CN or CP. So it was high time to update this act because different economic actors have complained for many years about chronic problems with the efficiency and reliability of rail services. 80% of the customers of shippers are dissatisfied with rail services in Canada. It is partly for this reason that they have called upon the government to act and to present a legislative measure that would oblige the main carriers, CN and CP, to reach service-level agreements with the shippers. Now, in reality, the shippers have trouble obtaining rather reliable and fair rail services. Some of them cannot even get contracts with major rail companies, and those who do have agreements experience major delays very often because they say that they don't have enough wagons at their disposal, enough rail cars at their disposal to transport the freight. The dissatisfaction level is high enough that we should wonder whether the major carriers are respecting their clients, and here, of course, I'm talking about CN and CP. So, as I said, this freight rail is a very important link across our country. Now, we've talked about the forestry industry and agriculture in remote regions in our country. It is very important that this rail link work. In the eastern townships, there is a municipality called Richmond, and it had one of the largest record of rail transport in the country. And when they started to give free rein to the markets, because we have to talk about infrastructure here as well, this municipality really suffered from this free market approach, and there was a veritable exodus on the part of the population and a rise in the unemployment rate, because we should not forget either that in certain remote regions of Canada, and I'll talk about my region in Quebec, we must often deal with subcontractors and even American rail companies who transport freight along border regions. There are bits of rail that have been sold to American companies, and they come into Canada, and that's where we see this transport. So we certainly need a bill in order to regulate and revitalize an economic sector that is very important for many rural regions of Canada. Once again, I'm talking about remote regions because since I've been here in Canada, I've always defended rural regions, because rural regions are what give our country an identity. It is the very identity of our country when rural regions are vital and prosperous.
Libre cours au marché, c'est correct. J'ai pas de trouble avec ça.
So I have no problem with that, but we do have to help small shippers because they do a lot of rail freight transport in the regions. Therefore, the poor quality of rail service transport costs our economy dearly, especially our rural communities, which are already hard hit by the decline in the manufacturing sector and the forest industry, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars each year and hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Many industries in Canada have to daily deal with losses caused by the problems of crops that have gone rotten because they've been left in poor conditions for too long while waiting for the services of the transporters or the carriers, work interruptions and disruptions and other things. The poor services provided undermine Canadian shippers who must respond to the just-in-time standard, which therefore undermines our ability to compete internationally. And this costs us also thousands of jobs when it doesn't lead quite simply to the closure of the small business and the company, as well as the drain that occurs in the regions. That said, a large part of the supply chain for industrial and agricultural economy relies on this system of transportation that must be effective and efficient if it wants to ensure competitive economic sectors in the global market. That's why shippers need to be able to reassure their clients about the service levels. I don't think the bill goes far enough. We hope the government will be open to changes. We know, Mr. Speaker, that questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-la-Chine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for having given his speech and shared his passion. Is this specific situation in his riding? Certain segments of the railways belong to American companies. We were talking about this. And I think it's important for him to clarify how this bill will affect that situation in his riding. Is it good for his riding? What more could be done to improve the situation? Because if I've understood correctly, these railways, that the parts or sections that belong to the American companies are located in his riding. So I'd like his comments on this. The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead. I want to thank my colleague. Well, what kind of situation this creates is this. No longer have to deal with just one carrier. It'll be two, and perhaps even three. So here we're talking about negotiating with different levels. And we're talking about small shippers in remote regions sometimes. And if we need to take all that time to negotiate the contracts with the big corporations and then go back to, they have to go back to the headquarters of the American company to negotiate, because they have to do that too. They also have to negotiate there. And there's no measures that are standardized to help those small and medium-sized businesses, because that is whom we're talking about. Well, once again, they will be behind others who are able to negotiate as they wish, and the small people are falling through the cracks, and these are sectors that are being abandoned, such as fisheries and so forth. Questions and comments?
Member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spent 9 years working on the railway as a signal maintenance man, and prior to that I grew up with my father working on the railway. And one of the things that was crucially important we saw everywhere as we went in our own travels, I lived in a little town called Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, and if I wanted to go to Moncton, I took a train. And today in Northern Ontario, the Ontario Northland Railway is shutting down. These smaller communities like the one I grew up in rely on that service. And under this government and the previous government, they allowed that to slip away. And it's not a luxury in many instances. It's their sole mode of transportation to get out of the areas that they're in. And sometimes you have to question, where's the oversight? Where are the people that should be standing up for these workers? I know that the member from Timmins, James Bay, and others from Sudbury in that area have worked hard. Our Northern Ontario folks have worked hard to try to keep that railway. But where's the government on that?
L'honorable député de Compton.
The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead. I want to thank my colleague. Unfortunately, the government is not there to protect the regions whose economies are hanging by a thread or by a railway sometimes. And as I mentioned, there's a region, Richmond, in the neighboring riding that has been abandoned. In my riding, historically speaking, before Sherbrooke, Sawyerville was the largest port for goods. It had the largest station for goods, and it was abandoned due to decisions made by governments in the 1940s and 1950s, and even back in the 1930s. And what this meant is that the regions are being abandoned. Regions have no other recourse than to tell us. They come to our offices and they say, help us. Help us. You have the power. You are able to help us and to ensure that we can keep our infrastructure. That also means investing in this infrastructure in order to create jobs. This creates jobs when these infrastructures are reliable and can continue. Here we're talking about agriculture, forestry, and manufacturing industries that are extremely important to ensure the survival of these regions.
There's enough time for a very brief question and comment. Une question très brève. L'honorable
Very brief question. The Honourable Member for Manitoulin, Algoma, Kapuskasing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just like to ask my colleague, and I'm following on the comments of my colleague from Hamilton Mountain, Stony Creek, and I'd like my colleague to tell me, if he can, or to talk about the fact that a lot of railways are being taken out. I know that in Sault Ste. Marie they were trying to really keep the lines and even update them. So the important thing is to ensure that this is kept, because it's very important and it will benefit us to use this kind of public transit, if you will. It's a shared system. The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead, we have to invest in these railways. Some lines cannot be restored without significant investments of millions, so we have to maintain them. And we can't give the burden to the municipalities and the provinces. They can't bear the cost. Sometimes we're talking about small municipalities. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Chac-Cartier. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to join my colleagues and to talk about C-52. I am a member of Parliament who comes from a rural region, and this is a very important issue for me and for my constituents. And I want to thank my colleagues for the speeches they gave before me, and this inspired me. It was really important. If the bill is passed as it stands, it will require a shipper to make an offer to enter into a contract respecting the manner in which the railway company must fill its service obligations to the shipper. It also creates an arbitration process to establish the terms of such a contract if the shipper and the railway company are unable to agree on them. That is a fair and equitable agreement after long negotiations. The tabling of the bill follows on the heels of many urgent demands by shippers across the country, as well as the work and incessant efforts of my colleague from Trinity Spadina, and I want to congratulate her for those efforts. After years of discussions with expert groups, in addition to the tabling last year of a bill, a private member's bill by my colleague, the Conservatives felt that they finally had to introduce this bill, which attempts to respond to the complaints in terms of service in the railway sector. And they offer inferior services. These companies have almost a monopoly on this sector. We have to look at the issues because the problems experienced by shippers across the country are real and directly affects our economy, particularly in the rural regions. In Canada, a number of my colleagues have mentioned this already, there are more than 70% of goods is shipped by rail across the country. But based on the examination of services 80% of shippers are dissatisfied with the services they obtain, probably because 80% of the commitments that they have made with large companies are not respected. So we see that clearly there is a problem, and it's time for the government to take action. And we have here a draft of a bill that we can work on, but there are a number of things that remain to be done. The current situation for shippers is quite difficult. Customers have difficulty obtaining fair and reliable services. Some don't even manage to get a contract with a large railway. And those who do have a contract have to deal with significant delays, or there are not enough rail cars that are available to transport all the freight that they need to transport for their industry, or rather they have to deal with a number of service disruptions, and this costs them directly in terms of the profits that they can make. And this can also ultimately lead to job losses. Another major problem that shippers face is that they often don't have a choice in their carrier, because after they have to deal with CN or CP, but not always the two. And those who do have an option between the two have to pay prices that are much too high, particularly when we're talking about small and medium-sized businesses in the rural regions, and sometimes they have difficulty surviving, and then they have to deal with these costs. So it's extremely difficult for these companies. A situation that I described affects a large number of economic sectors. We can talk about natural resources in general, agriculture, forestry, among others. These industries have products that are sent for export, and these goods are affected by the poor quality in services, the cost of services, and the major flaws in the railway system and the operation of the system undermine the overall competitiveness of Canada in the rest of the world. It costs jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars to our economy. Also, the affected industries are mainly located in rural regions in Quebec, British Columbia, and other provinces. This affects hundreds of thousands of people across the country. The government must take action rather quickly and do more than what C-52 does. I can think only of my riding, Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. We have a number of major companies. They employ thousands of people throughout the riding. They're far from urban centers. However, their services assured by rail. I can think also of a number of small and medium-sized businesses throughout my riding. But there are also major industries, Alcoa, for example, in Deschambault-Grandin, Grémont in Saint-Marc-de-Carrière, among others. And if we go back a few years ago, at one time there was also Bowater, which was served by the railway before the company unfortunately had to close. It declared bankruptcy and is now restricting access by employees to their pensions. This is another debate altogether. These companies, as I said, are responsible for a large part of the economy in my riding, and they deserve quality rail services, reliable rail services that will allow them to properly prepare for the transportation of their goods. And it has to be effective in order to ensure economic growth in my region. I can also think of farmers who depend on rail freight to send their goods across the country and elsewhere. In Saint-Raymond-de-Portneuf and in Sainte-Brigitte-de-Val and Lac-Beauport and elsewhere, there is a major industry that has had to close down because of issues with the railway. C-52, as I mentioned, is a first step in the right direction. There are good elements in it, and that's why I'll support it at second reading in order to send it to committee so it can be studied and improved. However, what we will have to work on is, for example, the protectionist measures put in place by C-52 that won't cover existing contracts between shippers and railway companies. This will leave a large number of clients without recourse. So there's a small handful of shippers who will be able to negotiate a new contract and benefit, therefore, from some of these protectionist measures, but others will have to remain and deal with the injustices that exist, and they will have just limited recourse. And in fact, this is extremely limited recourse at present. We'll also have to deal with the arbitration process that is set out in C-52. This is very limited and could be extremely costly for shippers who won't be able necessarily to go right to the end of the process and defend themselves against the major corporations, which often have much greater means to go through the process. So we'll have to talk about that aspect of the bill. Another troubling aspect is that C-52 completely ignores the issue of the high rates imposed on shippers by railway companies. And this is one of the main demands of the shippers and has been for years. As I mentioned, it's a quasi-monopoly, sometimes a real monopoly, because there is no other alternative other than one of the two major railways. So the ability of small companies to negotiate, they need these services, and this ability to negotiate is almost inexistent. They have to accept the prices that are given to them, and they are unable really to negotiate the rates. This is an issue that was neglected for a long time by this government. It still is not found in this bill that we have before us at second reading. And I hope that the Conservatives will support the amendments that the NDP will propose, because it's high time to take action. Canada's trade deficit is continuing to rise. It's $2 billion at present, if I'm not mistaken. Conservatives are dragging their feet with regard to these transportation issues. We have to go beyond C-52. We have to protect our shippers. We have to help our country and adopt a national strategy for rail transportation, for goods, but also for passenger transportation. In my riding, there is only one municipality that's where there is rail service, passenger rail service. And you can go to Saguenay, Lac Saint-Jean. It's mainly hunters who go and take advantage of what nature has to offer out there. But the government has to take action. It's starting with C-52, but we really have to go further, and we have to adopt a real rail strategy. Thank you.
And comments, questions?
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Chambly-Bourdois. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her speech. In fact, she talked about the fact that sometimes it's difficult to have service provided to small towns. She talked, I think, about Saint-Basile. We also have a Saint-Basile-le-Grand. If people don't pay attention to the name, they could wind up somewhere else. Sometimes in our ridings, we have situations where we're close to a major center, but we're not there, and we try to cooperate with CN in order to find a way to help these companies out. Sometimes it's difficult to work with CN or CP, whichever the case may be, because sometimes there's a bit of belligerence because of their quasi-monopoly. And sometimes they have a bit of a hard head, and we're very ready to work with them to ensure that we can help out the people who are affected. So I'd like her to talk a little bit about her experience. I think she's had similar experiences. And she could also talk about agreements as set out in the bill. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. I want to thank my colleague for that question and for his story with regard to Saint-Basile. I agree that can cause some problems, but to better situate you, we're in Portneuf. So I think it's really important to try to continue to cooperate with CN and CP to improve the rail services throughout the country. This is extremely important. I can't say it enough. In my speech, I talked about several major companies in my riding who depend on the railway system in the region in order to transport goods, as well as to get goods in order to ensure their production. I'm thinking of Alcoa. When we're talking about aluminum, it takes a lot of equipment and raw material that has to be transported, brought in, and each delay, each delivery that isn't delivered or that comes in late undermines the production of our companies and undermines the ability of Canada to compete on world markets. We have to resolve this problem quickly to ensure that our communities in all ridings can continue to grow and develop and keep their jobs. These jobs are so important to the rural regions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate my dear colleague for her speech and for her work. And her work representing the people in her riding. I know that she's extremely active and she does great work. In my riding, investment in the railway would be essential because I have a riding that is rural, and it is a problem if people can't get to the towns. It would be a great way to ensure public transit that's green and affordable, and I wonder if it's the same situation in her riding. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. I want to thank my colleague, and I want to return his compliment. I know he does the same level of work for his riding, and it's greatly appreciated by his constituents. In fact, the investments for passenger transportation is also unfortunately a question that is all too often ignored, but should be brought forward, because in thinking of my riding, I think we can compare ourselves to Pontiac. We have buses only, and people have brought this service about by coming together in order to have this service. They didn't have this service before. And for many years, we haven't had railway passenger service. I mentioned one municipality. It's a 1 hour away to get to Saguenay. So we should have access to the same railway services as elsewhere. We can think of the suburban or commuter train in Montreal. It would be very important and help to revitalize our rural communities that really need it by giving this access to major urban centers with something that is green, that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and families would be able to come back and settle in our regions, repopulate our communities, and this would encourage economic growth and development. It would be beneficial to the riding of Pontiac as well as Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier and other ridings across the country. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Saint-Constant. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased today to rise and speak on a bill that seeks to improve our rail system in Canada in this very snowy day today. I think that perhaps the trains are the only things that are not affected by the weather today.
So I'm pleased to speak today on a bill which, as I said, seeks to improve our freight rail transport system. So we will support this bill in order to send it to committee, and we will support it because most shippers are satisfied with the bill. So we will respect their position and support this bill. And this, in fact, is what distinguishes us from the other recognized parties in the House. It's because we listen to Canadians and Canadian businesses. So since we listen to them, we consult with them. And this is how we can develop good public policy. We are not imposing a solution or shoving solutions down the throats of Canadians, as do the Conservatives. The party in power seems to, unfortunately, like to impose its measures, which nobody likes. So we However, we believe that this bill should be amended because it does not reach the full objectives that it seeks to reach. Unfortunately, this is only a half measure. There are many demands made by shippers which were not included in the bill. The wording is completely ambiguous, and some provisions should be studied more in depth because they seem to contain loopholes. The scope of the bill is also limited because Bill C-52 will only cover new agreements and will not apply to existing ones. This is completely ridiculous because the bill is supposed to help shippers, but in fact it will only target a limited number of shippers. Most of them will be left to themselves and at the mercy of CN and CP. Shippers will have to be satisfied with low-quality service until the end of the contracts they have signed. So how can the Minister of Transport say it's a good bill which meets the needs of all shippers when in fact it only applies to a fraction of them? While some members of the shipper community wanted to talk about problems relating to rates within the legislative process, Conservatives have made it clear that they are not going to look at that matter until the next legislative review of the Transportation Act in 2014-2015. In most regions of the country, shippers have no other choice but to use CN or CP. Canada's rail transportation market is therefore a quasi-monopoly. And this dominant position allows CN and CP to charge high prices, and shippers have no choice but to pay these prices. And this is exactly what happens when the market is too deregulated. So in committee, the objective will be to bring about amendments to avoid abuse on the part of the market and by bringing in service level agreements between shippers and the railway companies. It will also be important to bring about a dispute resolution process. The bill only provides for a limited arbitration process. Now, this bill only applies to agreements which have already been signed. So instead of offering a quick and effective resolution process, the bill limits the scope of the bill to a very small group of shippers. Arbitration might be too expensive an option for many shippers, and they have a burden of proof which is much too heavy. We would also like to include penalties to dissuade the companies. As it now stands in the current version, the bill contains fines of $100,000, which would be paid to the federal government and not to shippers. Shippers will therefore have to incur losses, and we know that ultimately these losses will be passed on to the consumers. So we lose on two fronts. Consumers will pay higher prices, and the competitivity and performance of our companies on international markets will suffer. CN made a profit of $2.7 billion in 2012, so any monetary policies will really not have a dissuasive effect. Let's be clear today, 80% of rail transport users are not satisfied with the service they receive. They are victims because rail service in Canada is a quasi-monopoly. The agricultural, mining, forestry, and auto sectors are good examples of sectors which suffer because of this quasi-monopoly. Rotting crops, the interruption of production in plants and mines will be consequences amongst many others of this situation. many of Canada's products are destined for export markets, but their products are often held up because of weak rail service. A great deal of our resources are exported, and unfortunately for these exporting industries, an upset in the service will not be addressed by the bill. Unfortunately, I must interrupt the member because it's time for members' statements, but after question period, the member will have 3 minutes left to finish his speech.
Valley West.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Black History Month in Don Valley West and Toronto. The African-Canadian community dates back to the Underground Railway from 1840 to 1860. True to our history of diversity and inclusivity, Canada was the destination to freedom. I especially want to recognize a friend and leader within the African-Canadian community, the late Lincoln Alexander. Mr. Alexander was an incredible Torontonian, Ontarian, and Canadian. Community service and leadership were fundamental and core themes of his life. In 1968, he became the first African-Canadian Member of Parliament and Conservative, serving for over 15 years. He later became the first African-Canadian Lieutenant Governor and focused on education, racism, and youth issues in Ontario. His remarkable life and tireless dedication served to inspire future generations. I look forward to participating in events throughout my riding of Don Valley West to commemorate Black History Month. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Mr. Speaker, I recently met with a delegation of Canadian Christian community and representatives of the Canadian Tibetan and Chinese Uyghur communities, along with officials from the Federation for a Democratic China. This diverse delegation shared one major concern: this Conservative government's newfound relationship with China. Mr. Speaker, Canadians were not only concerned when the Prime Minister gave the go-ahead for the Chinese state-owned company CNOOC, basically a corporate extension of the Chinese Communist Party, to purchase Canadian oil and gas giant Nexen, but they were equally concerned with the secretive Canada-China Foreign Investment Protection Agreement. As an NDP's critic for human rights, I'm troubled with the human rights record of China, but also with CNOOC itself. CNOOC has been implicated in a number of very concerning human rights violations of Tibetans and Uyghurs, to supporting torture and imprisonment of Falun Gong members, and as well directly abusing workers in Burma. Mr. Speaker, just how repressive must a regime be before this government will refuse to do business with it?
The Honourable Member for Niagara West Glanbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to stand before the House today to share a rather touching story of the marked maturity of young students in my riding. In November, I received a package containing a petition from Ms. Makarowicz's grade 6 class from Our Lady of Fatima School in Grimsby. The class had been focused on social justice issues, specifically the story of Malala, the brave Pakistani girl who was brutally attacked for speaking out for young girls' rights to a proper education. The students were truly moved by her story and were shocked that 32 million girls worldwide are not in school today. They created and circulated a petition to staff and students in the school, bringing attention to Malala's story and the fundamental right for education for girls all around the world. Although this petition does not meet the guidelines for a petition to be certified, their efforts should still be recognized, with children like those and Ms. Makarowicz's class being future leaders of Canada. I am confident our country's future is secure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend, thousands of Canadians will be making a special voyage home. Canadians of Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese heritage and their families eagerly await the Lunar New Year, a time to see friends and family, and a time to remember those who have passed on. At home, and together with our communities and fellow Canadians, we remember and share our traditions of food, music, and the arts. We celebrate a year of hard work and share our hopes and wishes for the coming year. From my friends and colleagues in the House to all Canadians, 新年快乐，身体健康，心想事成. Happy New Year. May you have health, and may you achieve whatever your heart desires.
The Honourable Member for Calgary West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Monday, February 11th, Tibetans here in Canada and around the world will be celebrating the Year of the Snake. Tibetan New Year is celebrated on the first day of the first month of the Tibetan lunar calendar. This marks the year 2140. The celebration lasts up to 15 days, with the first 3 days being the most significant. New Year's typically means celebrations, togetherness, family time, as well as prayers. I wish all the Tibetans inside and outside of Tibet much health and happiness. May we all join in wishing them a Happy New Year, or Losar Tachi Derek.
The Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Kapuskasing.
Mr. Speaker, water levels in Lake Huron are at an all-time low, and people are getting worried. Wetlands are endangered, docks and boat ramps are high and dry, exposed water lines are freezing, and the harbour at South Bay Mouth on Manitoulin Island will have to be dredged so the Chichiman ferry can reach the dock. While this government sits on its hands, the cost of low water is soaring. Property values are affected, and now freighters on the Great Lakes are running light so they don't bottom out. The International Joint Commission has adopted a wait-and-see stance that isn't sitting well with the communities, businesses, and individuals affected. They want action and are pointing to the derelict work order for compensating structures in the St. Clair River as a good place to start. The speed bumps were called for in 1917 to offset the increased water flow from repeated dredging of that river's shipping channel, but have never been built. With water levels down in all the Great Lakes, it's time to protect these Canadian crown jewels and reverse the mounting environmental and economic crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here. Honourable Member for Simcoe Grey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise today to announce the commencement of winter festivals. Snowmania in Wasaga Beach, located in my riding of Simcoe Grey. Snowmania is a celebration celebrating its 8th year, and this festival starts off with a snowman building competition and has grown over the last number of years to a 4-day winter extravaganza in February of each year. This year, the volunteer committee has put together a polar bear dip, which I'm hoping my colleagues will participate in, a ball hockey tournament, demolition derby, numerous other things, and a snowman building competition, obviously. But I'd most likely like to thank the Wasaga Beach Chamber of Commerce, the town of Wasaga Beach, and all the local volunteers, including the 2013 committee of Doug McCulloch, Ross and Marianne Go, Peter Wilson, Ahab Messad, Tanya Snell, and the Rotary Club President Todd Young for their outstanding service, their generosity of spirit, and all their volunteer efforts to make this great event happen every year. Canadians should be proud of their winter heritage, and I'm exceptionally proud of these volunteers in my riding that make things happen so that Canadians can enjoy the winter.
Yes, here.
The Honourable Member for Newmarket Aurora.
Mr. Speaker, there is a great deal of excitement these days in the town of Aurora, a vibrant community in my riding located in the heart of York Region. For Aurora, a town that uniquely blends an urban sophistication with the charm of its rural roots, is celebrating its 150th birthday. On February the 3rd, the anniversary date of the town's inauguration, I and hundreds of proud residents kicked off the celebration at the mayor's sesquicentennial levee. Rich in culture and steeped in heritage, residents are passionate about remembering and preserving the history of their beloved town. Indeed, with the help of a dedicated group of volunteers, Aurora will be marking each season in 2013 with a celebratory event to acknowledge its past, present, and future. I invite all Canadians to visit the town of Aurora this year and join the celebration.
The Honourable Member, recently I had the opportunity to give out food at food banks. The food we gave out were hundreds of pounds of meat from deer killed in a national park. I'd like to recognize the excellent work done by the food banks Maison de Secours de la Frontière and the Centre Centraide Familiale de la MRC de Montmorency, Mission Kamouraska, Saint-Vincent-de-Paul. All of their managers and volunteers and employees don't want their fellow human beings to be without dignity. Every year, they find the resources to make meals for people going through tough times. I'd like to recognize Moisson Beauce and the Frigo Plein in Bellechasse. MPs for Beauce and Lévis-Bellechasse paid them a courtesy visit, and I'll leave it up to them to speak to the important work these organizations do. These organizations say that the number of people going hungry are going up for 4 years, and it's incumbent on all of us to help them.
For St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to an ambitious free trade agreement with the European Union, an agreement that is expected to boost Canada's economy by the equivalent of $1,000 for every Canadian family. Shamefully, the NDP and their anti-trade allies consistently oppose our government's plans to open up new markets for Canadian exporters. The former NDP trade critic and MP for Windsor West has said that he supports the efforts of big union bosses to stop any further trade negotiations with Korea, Japan, and the European Union. And another former NDP trade critic, the member for Burnaby New Westminster, summarized his party's views when he said that free trade has, quote, cost Canadians dearly, end quote. Mr. Speaker, a leopard can't change its spots, and the NDP can't hide their anti-trade agenda. In challenging global economic times, Canadians know that it's only our government with a pro-trade plan to generate jobs, growth, and long-term prosperity.
The honourable member for British Columbia Southern Interior.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Cliff Pallick and the West Kootenay concerned citizens for hosting sessions on smart meters and wireless technology in Castlegar Trail and Slocan Park. The guest speaker, Jerry Flynn, a retired naval officer, spent most of his military career working in signals intelligence, electronic, and radio warfare. Fortis BC has made an application with the BC's Utilities Commission to introduce wireless smart meters in our area. According to Flynn, the ambient level of electromagnetic resonance in our society is already extremely toxic, and wireless smart meters will dramatically increase this danger. Flynn noted that Canada's Safety Code 6 guidelines are based solely on industry studies which consider only thermal effects but ignore the known and dangerous effects of non-thermal microwave radiation on biological systems. In keeping with the precautionary principle being urged by numerous independent scientists around the world, we should only consider installing wired meter technology in all our homes, as these are risk-free. Thanks again, Cliff and Jerry, for increasing our awareness.
Member for Miramichi.
Mr. Speaker, as the cold winter drags into February, many Canadian families are looking into vacations to either ski on top of the snow or get away from the cold altogether. Of course, one Canadian is scheming up a new way to make it harder for Canadians to take these vacations in the future. This person has a plan to impose a new $20 billion job-killing carbon tax on Canadian taxpayers. He wants to impose this job-killing carbon tax to generate billions of dollars in revenues. This $20 billion job-killing carbon tax will make it harder for Canadians to take these vacations in the future because they'll be paying more for everything, including gas, groceries, and electricity. Mr. Speaker, the person pushing this $20 billion job-killing carbon tax is none other than the leader of the NDP.
The honourable member for Avalon.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's Outstanding Principal Award is a special recognition through the Learning Program that will acknowledge the achievements of 51 school principals in Canada. The Learning Program is a charitable organization dedicated to a strong public education system. I am so pleased that 2 of the 51 principals receiving this prestigious recognition in 2013 are from the riding of Avalon. Joy Brown, principal of Coley's Point Primary in Bay Roberts, and Robin McGraw, principal of Holy Cross Elementary in Holyrood, will be honored during a gala event in Toronto later this month. These 2 individuals were selected from a large number of nominations by a committee of distinguished education, community, and private sector leaders. Mr. Speaker, for every successful school, there's a successful principal that strives for excellence in education. They engage their communities, mentor their staff, and create safe and nurturing learning environment for their students. I join the students, teachers, and staff and parents of Coley's Point Primary and Holy Cross Elementary to congratulate Joy Brown and Robin McGraw for being recognized as one of Canada's outstanding principals. They've made their teaching colleagues, schools, communities, and province very proud. Keep up the good work.
For Dauphin, Swan River, Marquette.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP and their leader are trying to fool Canadians yet again. And how do you ask? The NDP leader wants to generate billions with the NDP proposal to impose a $20 billion carbon tax on Canadian families. During the NDP leadership campaign, the current NDP leader said, and I quote, "I have proposed a system of carbon pricing which will produce billions," unquote. This sneaky $20 billion job-killing carbon tax will increase the price of absolutely everything. And studies show that the negative effects of the NDP's carbon tax would be most keenly felt by low-income Canadians and those who live in rural regions. This exposes the NDP for what they really are, the party of big union bosses and special interest groups who cry crocodile tears for people who live on low incomes. Mr. Speaker, our government will continue to stand firm against this $20 billion carbon tax and work hard for Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Monsieur le Président. Mr. Speaker, this government has plundered our public treasury, and it goes on. They've spent millions of dollars on advertising. Conservative senators such as Harb, Duffy, and Brazeau, and Mr. Harper vowed never to appoint senators, are filling their pockets. They're stealing money. Unfortunately, in the House of Commons, it's not better. The Human Resources Minister, who calls the unemployed bad guys, a minister who uses helicopters as a personal taxi, and millions of dollars to rewrite Canadian history, to misinform Canadians. It seems that the Prime Minister is surrounded by yes men, and Conservatives should apply their demands for accountability of others to themselves. That is their job as members of Parliament. It is important for the NDP that taxpayers' money be well spent, and we will ensure this in a few years.
Mr. Speaker, in 1994, the majority Liberal government introduced the Electoral Boundaries Readjustment Suspension Act. The purpose of the bill was to suspend the independent electoral boundaries commissions of 1994, as the Liberals did not like the electoral boundaries proposed by the commissions. Yesterday, the member for Wascana tried to mislead Canadians, indicating that the Prime Minister, quote, accepted the previous government's intent at the time, and the Conservatives voted for it, end quote. Not only is this completely false, Mr. Speaker, but it is hypocritical, which is no surprise coming from the Liberal Party. At the time, the Liberals criticized the independent commissions, as stated by Liberal MP Don Boudria, who said, quote, members must realize that the redistribution is most unfair to British Columbia and Ontario. Mr. Speaker, the member for Wascana knows full well that the Prime Minister fought and voted against this undemocratic Liberal bill, and I would be more than happy to table the results of the April 13th, 1994 vote of C-18 following question period.
Oral questions, questions orales.
The honourable member for Holly-Elmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives made deceptive phone calls to an entire province, and the Prime Minister says harassing the people of Saskatchewan like this is just fine, even though his own caucus calls them deceptive and says they were wrong to do so. Why won't the Prime Minister also admit this was wrong? And will the government support the NDP's bill to crack down on this sort of deceptive and misleading calls?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, because I did want to talk about one NDP bill, because you see, the NDP critic for democratic reform said that the Electoral Boundary Commission serve in good faith and expect non-interference from political parties. But the NDP actually have a bill before this House right now to overturn the work of those nonpartisan electoral boundary commissions in the form of Bill C-396, where they don't accept the work they've done in the past, and they're in fact trying to use the power of the House and their ability to present legislation here to overturn that work. It's an example of exactly what the NDP does all the time. Do as we say, not as we do.
Honourable member for Holly-Elmer. Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard any apologies given to the people of Saskatchewan in this House. That is why the Conservatives take them for granted, whether they live in cities or in rural regions. The Conservatives used in Saskatchewan the same firm as Pierre Poutine. They used a bogus company to hide their actions, and now they claim that it is normal to attack an independent commission. We have to end Conservative wrongdoing. Will the government clarify CRTC rules with regard to the use of these calls? The Honourable Leader of the Government House Leader.
Continue to pursue this with their do as I say, not as I do approach. They criticized the automated calls, yet they made exactly those automated calls, both in Burnaby Douglas with regard to the process on redistribution and with regard to one of their caucus colleagues after she left. They criticize involving themselves, us in being involved in the redistribution process. Well, they've done so vigorously from their side, and they say that one must respect the work of the independent commissions, and then they push bills in this House to overturn the work of the independent commissions. They've had a monopoly for years on sanctimony. Now they've got a monopoly on sanctimonious hypocrisy.
The honourable member for Hull Elmer.
Monsieur le Président, ce matin, on a assisté.
Mr. Speaker, this morning we saw the sad spectacle of Senator Brazeau appearing in court. The Conservative senator appointed by the Prime Minister, who was already under investigation for having stolen from the Senate and committed tax fraud. He made sexist remarks to a journalist and, in addition, insulted Aboriginal leaders. The Prime Minister still has not admitted that it was a mistake to give a job for life to Senator Brazeau. Will he now admit it and ensure that taxpayers recover the money that they were cheated of? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, because of the seriousness of these events, the Senator was expelled from caucus. The legal system will see to this affair. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
Tal Brazeau serves his full term until 2049. He will collect over $7 million in salary alone. He is that Prime Minister $7 million mistake. They can't stop his salary, but they can stop this unelected senator from collecting illegitimate living expenses. What is the government's plan to return the money to the taxpayers?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the serious charges that have been laid, he has been removed from the caucus, and of course the legal system will proceed forthwith on those matters. In terms of housing allowances and the like, the Board of Internal Economy over at the Senate has, of course, been seized of these matters, and of course today several were referred to an independent outside auditor to ensure that they are dealt with appropriately through independent oversight.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. It's not very complicated, though. Why don't they admit they made a huge error? They know that this fellow had a shady past, but they still appointed him to the Senate. The Conservatives continue to draw on their bottomless well of hypocrisy. After calling the Senate a 19th century relic, the Prime Minister has now appointed more senators than Brian Mulroney. Taxpayers have to pony up millions of dollars so that the Prime Minister's cronies and Conservative donors can laze around till the end of their days. Why don't they just abolish this archaic, non-democratic institution that is more obsolete than phonographs? Honourable Government House Leader.
The government has been pursuing an ambitious agenda of democratic reform changes to the Senate. In fact, our Prime Minister has appointed every single democratically elected senator that he has an opportunity to do so, including one just a couple of weeks ago. We would encourage all provinces to provide that opportunity for democratically senators to be appointed to the Senate, and we would also encourage the other parties who have consistently opposed such changes to modernize and democratize our important parliamentary institutions to change their positions and actually support real reforms that will make the Senate accountable to all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for St. Leonard, St. Michel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jobs continued to disappear last month. Canada has lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs since the recession. These same industries are forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars more in taxes on salaries because the Conservatives continue to increase employment insurance premiums. Will the government pledge in this House to reverse the employment insurance premium hikes that it did in 2014? Jobs are at stake. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, our priority is job creation, economic growth in a sustainable way, in a long-term way, and that is why we reduced rates. We've reduced taxes over 140 times, so for an average family can keep close to $3,000 in their pockets because of the changes our government made to help families with tax reductions. Honourable Member for St. Leonard, St. Michel. Mr. Speaker.
1,000 jobs last month. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, the Conservatives' EI payroll hike have already cost the economy almost 300,000 person-years of employment. But 3 consecutive EI tax hikes don't seem to be enough for this government. They want to hike taxes again. I realize that the Conservatives abandoned most of their principles when they came to power. But when exactly did they begin to believe that the best way to create jobs is by increasing taxes on employers and employees?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, we know that the best way to create jobs is actually to reduce taxes, which is why we've done that 140 times. That's why the average family pays $3,000 less in tax today as a result of our changes, and perhaps that's why we've seen over 900,000 net new jobs since the economic downturn, the very best track record on job creation in the entire G7, and in fact, it is a record that we expect to continue into the future. According to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, Canada will see that prosperity continue as a leader into the decades ahead.
Very good. We'll not have an update.
The honourable member for Saint-Laurent, Cartierville.
What will the Minister of Democratic Reform do now? Will he join the government House Leader's Parliamentary Secretary in condemning the Conservative Party's deceptive attempts to intimidate Saskatchewan's Independent Electoral Commission? Will he commit to upholding open, fair and democratic practices? Or will he be blind to his government's latest devious breach of democracy in joining his Prime Minister in defending the indefensible?
And the Honourable Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, the electoral boundary process encourages input from parliamentarians, political parties, and the public. Mr. Speaker, it is well known that our party agrees with the 75% majority of public submissions opposed to the Commission's proposals in Saskatchewan. And, Mr. Speaker, while we are working and respecting the process, on the other hand, the Liberals, while in government in 1994, introduced legislation that would have suspended the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission. We would not do that.
The honourable member for Rimouski, Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Mr. Speaker, today we learned that close to 22,000 net jobs were lost in January. Now that's the type of news that the Conservatives don't want us to know when they insist on allowing the PBO's mandate to expire and drag its feet on finding a replacement for him. Why doesn't the government want to extend the PBO's mandate? When will he stop leaving Canadians in the dark? And why does financial accountability scare them so much? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we want a parliamentary budget office that is impartial and gives a credible opinion on fiscal matters. The Librarian of Parliament has retained the services of a search firm. We do not have the intention of putting this position outside of the Library of Parliament. The Honourable Member.
Speaker, we learned today that we lost 22,000 net jobs in January, and this is much worse than the experts predicted. And it flies in the face of their job creation claims. Really, reality simply doesn't match their talking points, and without the PBO, it will be that much harder to learn the truth. Instead of hiding from accountability, why won't this government extend the Parliamentary Budget Officer's mandate until a replacement is found?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to say very clearly that we sympathize with the loss of jobs for many Canadians today. However, having said that, we have an economic action plan that has, in fact, worked. We've seen over 900,000 net new jobs created here in Canada since the end of the recession, July 2009. Now, having said that, we intend to continue with our economic action plan into 2013 to create jobs, to make sure long-term prosperity is in our future, and to make sure our economy continues to grow.
The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, after the government lost the personal information of hundreds of thousands of Canadians, it took political pressure and a number of collective lawsuits to force them to act. The solution to fully protect the victims of this fiasco would cost $100 million per year for life. The Conservatives are trying to play hero by offering much less for only 6 years. When will they take privacy protection seriously and truly protect victims? Honourable Minister of Human Resources. Mr. Speaker, The loss of this information by the department is completely unacceptable because it should never have happened. Mr. Speaker, we are seizing every opportunity to help people and to protect them with Equifax services, offering these services freely to Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I have also instructed the department to change its system to protect Canadians. The honourable member for Pontiac.
I've got a newsflash for the minister. That's just not good enough. It's not even as much as her own department has recommended. For just a moment, can the minister at least try and put herself in the shoes of the more than 500,000 Canadian victims? First, their personal information was lost, and now some have learned the Conservative government is adding insult to injury, informing them of this loss to total strangers. Mr. Speaker, when will the minister take privacy seriously, and what is her plan?
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources. Mr. Speaker, we take the privacy protection of Canadians very seriously, and Mr. Speaker, that is why we informed the Office of the Privacy Commissioner right away of this matter. Mr. Speaker, it is extremely important for the department to keep this information. Fortunately, at this point, there is no evidence that this lost information was used for fraudulent purposes.
The honourable member for Gatineau.
Wow, welcome to Fantasy Island, starring the Minister of Human Resource. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, we know that Senator Brazo will collect another $7 million if he serves out his full term until 2049. But if we add up the tab of all of this Prime Minister's appointees, they will collect over $115 million from taxpayers. Wow, indeed. Is a $115 million bill and Senate ethics rules stuck in the dark ages really going to be this Prime Minister's legacy on Senate reform?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, we want to see a more democratic, accountable, and representative Senate. That is why we took action and referred Senate reform to the Supreme Court. Our reference to the Supreme Court will accelerate the process of reforming the Senate and lay the foundation for further Senate reform.
The honourable member for Gatineau. Zero credibility, Mr. Speaker. That's the problem with this government. The Prime Minister can try and wash his hands of it, but it is he who gave a job for life to Senator Brazo, so it is he who is responsible. The Conservatives appointed him knowing full well that he had numerous sexual harassment complaints against him and that he was not paying child support for his son, and yet they kept him in their caucus after he made sexist remarks to a journalist. The Prime Minister even said that he is a distinguished man. So why did they wait so long before expelling him from the Conservative caucus?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, at the time the Senator was appointed, he was, of course, the National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, one of Canada's national Aboriginal organizations. Obviously, in light of recent events, action has been taken. He has been removed from caucus, and appropriate steps are being taken, of course, by law enforcement authorities and, of course, by the Senate through its own review process.
The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. If only this was a random case, but in the long list of party cronies appointed to the Senate by the Prime Minister, abuse is far too frequent. Senator Duffy pretends to live on Prince Edward Island. Senator Harb has a living allowance to live in his own house. And Senator Wallen maybe lives in Saskatchewan, but we're not really sure. That's a lot of wasted money. What will the Conservatives do to ensure that taxpayers recover this money that they have wrongfully paid? The Honourable Government House Leader. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Standing Senate Committee on Internal Economy is currently examining the recommendations on living allowances And we expect the committee to follow up on these recommendations, but it is also true that today the internal economy is going to send files of some of these senators to an external auditor, Deloitte, so that they can report back.
For Scarborough Southwest.
Well, in addition to Senator Brazo, we've got Liberal Senator Mac Harb claiming a housing allowance despite living here for decades. Fictional PEIer Mike Duffy, who literally runs through kitchens to avoid answering questions about his residency, and now Pamela Wallin refusing to confirm whether she lives in Saskatchewan or not. Now, the Prime Minister has made 58 Senate appointments and has now unseated Brian Mulroney as the king of Conservative patronage. Now, when will they get serious about permanently fixing the Senate and abolish it?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Reform.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the NDP are in a bit of a contradiction here. They cannot blame the Senate for having unelected senators because they refuse to pass legislation to allow senators to be elected. We have taken action to make the Senate more democratic, accountable, and representative. That's why we referred the whole issue to the Supreme Court of Canada. Our reference to the Supreme Court will accelerate the process of Senate reform and lay the foundation for further reform.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough Southwest.
Well, we voted against it because it's an expensive Band-Aid, not a solution to the $90 billion a year boondoggle that is the Senate. Now, at the end of the day, the Prime Minister's bagmen, campaign managers, failed candidates, and personal friends will collect over $115 million in salary from taxpayers. Senator Brazo alone will collect $7 million. Now, we could save hardworking taxpayers $90 million a year by getting rid of the Senate. So it's a black hole of accountability and a national embarrassment. And when are they going to do the right thing and abolish it?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the member opposite that, in fact, they didn't vote on it because at every opportunity they actually filibustered and didn't even let the whole issue come to a vote. That's what the NDP stand on. They're delaying Senate reform. On this side of the House, we are taking action, refer the whole issue to the Supreme Court, and accelerating the pace of Senate reform and laying the foundation for further reform.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Mr. Speaker, the incompetence continues regarding the data breach and mailouts now going to the wrong people. Now, we know the minister didn't stuff the envelopes, just like we know that she didn't personally lose the hard drive. But, Mr. Speaker, it's the disinterest that she's shown in the issue, the disinformation she shared, and the disrespect for the 600,000 Canadians who've been affected by refusing to go to the House committee and be accountable. And answer for her inaction and her feeble response. Will the minister do the right thing and appear at committee?
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the first problem mentioned has already been identified. Solutions have been taken. The problem has been fixed. But, Mr. Speaker, this situation is totally unacceptable, particularly because it was avoidable. Mr. Speaker, that's why I have instructed the department to completely overhaul its IT systems, its security processes, and to have the staff trained to make sure that this sort of thing never happens again to Canadians.
The Honourable Member for St. Laurent-Cartierville. Mr. Speaker, after he allowed the government to invest nothing in AFISMA and to offer nothing to help restore democracy in Mali, close our embassies and offices in Gabon, Guinea, and Niger, and reduce the number of francophone countries in Africa considered as a priority by CETA to 3. Will the Minister of the Francophonie wake up and do his duty? Will he ensure that the Francophonie countries in Africa are not the next victims of this government in the next budget?
Canada has a very long history of support for the people of Mali. In fact, the ambassador of Mali called Canada's assistance exemplary. We remain concerned with the situation in Mali, and that's why the minister announced additional support for Mali for humanitarian assistance, emergency health care, access to water and food for displaced people and for refugees.
Very good. The
Honourable Member for St. Maurice Champlain. Mr. Speaker, this week a number of members reminded the public of the government's abandonment of the universal child care program. To replace this program, the Conservatives pledged in 2006 to offer tax credits to employers for the creation of new child care spaces. They promised that 125,000 new spaces would be created over 5 years. how many spaces have been created to date, and have they allowed single mothers to have access to an affordable childcare network? Mr. Speaker, it is our party believes that it is parents who know best how to raise their children, and that is very important. That is why we introduced this program. And Mr. Speaker, part of the program supports the creation of childcare spaces, and up until between 2006 and 2010, over 110,000 spaces were created. We don't have the figures since that time, but we are supporting parents.
Mr. Speaker, did the Conservatives learn anything from the Ashley Smith tragedy? The correctional investigator sounded the alarm about a dramatic increase of serious self-injury in federal prisons. But instead of taking action, the Conservatives are closing Canada's only program dedicated to treating self-harm. What is the minister thinking? How can Corrections Canada prevent the next tragedy without any support?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the member is absolutely incorrect. What the project that she is referring to was a pilot project. It has concluded. These services will be offered at all institutions and will be part of the regular case management process. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Alfred Pillin. In fact, Mr. Speaker, statistics by the correctional investigator are alarming. In 5 years, the number of incidents of self-harm has almost tripled. This is a serious situation, and we must fix it immediately in order to avoid other tragedies, such as that of Ashley Smith. Self-harm is a serious problem in our prisons, Mr. Speaker. Cutting programs that allowed to specifically fight this scourge is a monumental error. What is the goal of the Minister of Public Safety, reintegration or self-harm?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is absolutely wrong. It was a pilot project. We've taken those lessons learned from that pilot project, and we're integrating them across the country to help inmates who are dealing with mental health issues. Mr. Speaker, our government and Corrections Service Canada is leading the way. We have initiated a number of things, including a 90-day assessment. When inmates enter a facility, Mr. Speaker, they are assessed and they are treated accordingly. There's more work to do, but we're leading the way. No projects have been cut. This was a pilot project. We're using the lessons learned across the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Mr. Speaker, we learned this morning that the contaminated meat recall at XL Foods cost taxpayers $2 million. This kind of situation could be avoided if the Conservatives had not cut the number of inspector positions at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They thought they were saving money by cutting services, but the recall is costing more than the inspector positions. Mr. Speaker, when will the Conservatives stop improvising and putting people's lives in danger with their irresponsible cuts? Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Food safety is our top priority, and since 2006, the government has increased by 20% the number of inspectors and the CFIA budget. The government will continue to provide the resources needed to ensure the safety of our food system. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Campus Casing.
Mr. Speaker, we're just now learning the full cost of the XL Foods meat recall of last fall. The cost of almost 40 staff, plus overtime, plus travel, plus accommodation, leaves taxpayers on the hook for over $2 million. My question is simple. After the largest meat recall in Canadian history, after all these costs, after 18 Canadians fell ill, have Conservatives learned their lesson? Will they be reversing their reckless plan cuts to CFIA?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. As I just said, safe food for Canadian consumers is our top priority, and since 2006, our government has increased the number of inspectors and the budget of the CFIA by roughly 20%. But, Mr. Speaker, I must point out that every time that we impose a measure or we implement a measure through our budget to increase finances or funding for food safety, the opposition, the NDP in particular, they vote against each and every measure. It's shameful, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, speaking in Montreal, the Leader of the Opposition tried to articulate what the NDP's foreign policy would be. Unbelievably, Mr. Speaker, his speech demonstrated to Canadians that the NDP leader wants to take Canada back to a foreign policy approach where Canadian values are secondary and every dictator with a vote at the UN would be pandered to. Mr. Speaker, can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs please tell the House our government's approach to foreign policy?
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. As he said, the Leader of the Opposition showed yesterday that he wants to take Canada back to failed foreign policy approaches. Canada will no longer go along just to get along. We have consistently protected and promoted freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law around the world. Our government has a principled foreign policy approach. Under our government, Canada no longer panders to every dictator with a vote at the United Nations.
That's right.
The NDP leader would kill trade agreements and hurt Canadian exports. He would also send Canadian taxpayers' dollars to developing countries without any plan to achieve results. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead. Let's come back to serious matters, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative attack on Quebec continues in their vicious quota system to cut employment insurance. The target for Quebec is higher than anywhere else. 40% of the cuts are to come from my province. This is unacceptable. It is no less than a clear attack against Quebec and its regions. Quebecers have paid for employment insurance. It belongs to them. The Conservatives are taking away their money, attacking their way of life, and destroying their economy, which is important to the regions. Will the minister listen to reason and abandon these destructive and irresponsible cuts? The Honourable Minister of Human Resources. Mr. Speaker, we have an employment insurance system that is throughout the country, and it's extremely important to ensure the integrity of the system. That is why we have various means in order to identify ineligible benefits in order to protect the integrity of the system. This is extremely important. It's important to ensure that the money, taxpayers' money, is spent in a very responsible manner. Thank you.
Tony Creek.
Mr. Speaker, almost half of all Canadian jobs are created by small business. Most of them are family businesses. And they're now finding out that unemployment insurance or employment insurance is not there for them. Tariq Anwar worked for 14 years in his family restaurant. The family sold the restaurant. He found himself out of work. And he's told that he's ineligible for EI after paying in it all those years. Ineligible because he's related to the owner. To the minister, is that fair? Rather than cutting EI, why not try administering it fairly or at the very least competently?
The Honourable Minister.
Employment insurance is there for those who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. But, Mr. Speaker, it's important to understand that it's there for them while they're looking for another job. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is helping people to connect with jobs, whether it's through the employment insurance system or programs like labour market agreements that help Canadians who have lost their job or who are out of work to get back into the labour market. We've expanded this system, not cut it. Mr. Speaker, our priority is job creation and growth, and we're doing everything we can to help Canadians get back to work.
Goodness. Honourable Member for British Columbia, Southern Interior.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's probably time for the minister to get out of her glass bubble and actually talk to people affected by these cuts. The fruit industry in British Columbia depends on seasonal workers, but under the new EI rules, seasonal workers will be forced to accept any work that comes along. With these demands, there will be a dramatic increase in the number of workers available to help with the harvest. Fruit growers will be left scrambling with harvest and delivery. When is this government going to reverse these changes that negatively affect seasonal workers?
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, our goal is to make sure that when Canadians work, they're better off than when they don't. Mr. Speaker, we have a shortage of skills and labour right across this country. Employers are desperate for help, so desperate that they're having to pay extra costs just to bring in outside workers when we do have qualified Canadians for those jobs. We want to help connect Canadians Canadians with those jobs so that they and their families and their employers are all better off.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, by attacking the unemployed with their EI reform, the Conservatives have forgotten to think about citizens with a functional limitation. Their reform means having to accept any job located 1 hour from the residence, and yet workers with a disability don't have the same ability to travel as others. They're being asked to do the impossible, and they're threatened with being punished if they don't obey. Will the minister ultimately admit that her reform is punishing the workers, particularly those who live with a functional limitation? The Honourable Minister of Human Resources. Mr. Speaker, no government of Canada has done more than ours in order to support individuals with functional limitations. Mr. Speaker, the employment insurance system respects that goal, and that is why all decisions with regard to eligibility for a job for an unemployed individual is based on individual circumstances. This is extremely important to recognize that, Mr. Speaker, because this is a principle of the system.
Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Mr. Speaker, the Environment Commissioner just told the government to increase the money operators set aside to cover the cost of a nuclear or offshore drilling accident. The liability cap is out of date now, far below what other countries require. Previous bills to take taxpayers off the hook for nuclear accidents had overwhelming support, but died in 2008 because of an early election call, in 2009 because of prorogation, and in 2010 simply from neglect. Will the Conservatives now raise liability caps, and when will we see properly reviewed legislation, standalone legislation, to do it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Our liability regime is the polluter pays principle. And I should point out, as I did the other day, that in fact the Commissioner of Environment said that in terms of nuclear liability limits, that Canada has acknowledged that it is too low. My understanding is they're looking at this now and they will be taking action in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, that action would have been taken years ago if the NDP hadn't been so determined to filibuster. They insisted on putting their own ideology ahead of public safety, as they usually do.
The Honourable Member for Sydney, Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, the latest towboat incident and the numerous abandoned ships on our shores that threaten our environment and our navigation lines demonstrates the need for strict regulations so companies are held accountable for towing vessels and removing them when they are cut loose. Presently, there is money secure for oil tanker navigation in our waters, but we need similar legislation for other types of vessels as well. Will this government act now to ensure that the safety of our shores and our navigable waters?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we do take very seriously the continued safety of our navigable waters and our role as the regulator for offshore shipping. That being said, it is necessary for us to work with our provincial counterparts, as there is often overlap in jurisdictions in this regard, and I would encourage the honourable member to work with us as we do that.
Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. While astronaut Chris Hadfield is inspiring all Canadians through his role at the International Space Station, the Conservatives are abandoning the 700 employees at the Canadian Space Agency. The agency is dealing with financial difficulties, and the Conservatives don't care. The President even resigned last week, discouraged not to see his projects move forward. What will the Conservatives do to keep the expertise of the agency's employees here in Canada? Will they leave them without a line? Honourable Minister of Industry, Mr. Speaker, nothing is more untrue. If she had looked last week, we announced a commitment to radar stat. It's very important, and it's very important in the world when we talk about satellites, but we're very pleased to have Chris Hadfield. He's the first commander of the International Space Station, and in our Economic Action Plan in 2012, we announced Canada's participation in the International Space Station to 2020, which allows Chris Hadfield to take on that role, and we're very proud of him. Yes, Honourable Member for Kamouraska-Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tourism industry is concerned about the constant drop with international visitors who are spending less in Canada. This is opposite from the trend because we're seeing a 4% increase elsewhere. We were wondering why Canada is failing to benefit, except when we look at the actions of the Conservatives and the Canadian Tourism Commission, which is underfunded and has been for years. In fact, the Conservatives are continuing to cut its budget, unlike all other competitors to Canada throughout the world. What measures will the Conservatives take to adopt in the next budget in order to correct this situation? The Honourable Minister of Industry, Mr. Speaker. That's quite pessimistic as a vision because we're extremely competitive in terms of tourism, Mr. Speaker. That is why our government launched a federal strategy on tourism. And I want to remind my colleague, Mr. Speaker, that we are on the right track despite the economic slowdown around the world. Tourism expenditures increased for 13 consecutive quarters in the country. More and more jobs tied to the tourism sector are being created, and we're continuing to attract tourists from China and Brazil. Things are going well in this sector, and they will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Quinty West.
Mr. Speaker, our government has consistently taken steps to ensure our correctional system actually corrects criminal behavior while respecting taxpayers' dollars. Radical left-wing special interests have complained that our government is treating criminals inhumanely by using the common practice of double bunking. Could the Parliamentary Secretary update the House on our government's position on double bunking?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, that member is absolutely correct. Double bunking is a completely normal practice used by many Western countries. Corrections Canada's last year completed a study that showed that the rates of double bunking were not connected to the rates of violence. The fact of the matter is, contrary to the suggestion of the member for Burnaby New Westminster that prison populations would explode, the increases have actually been less than a quarter of what CSC predicted. Not only are the NDP soft on crime, Mr. Speaker, but they're absolutely soft on facts.
Honourable Member for Avalon.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister from Labrador is still under a cloud of serious election violations, but he's doing nothing to help himself. Instead of coming clean and opening his books, he's helping up to cover up more Conservative election fraud. He has given a high-paying job to Chris Crawford, the former Sims database manager. If the Minister from Labrador, who still knows how to speak, could he get up and explain why he hired Mr. Crawford in his office in the first place, and what Crawford knows about Pierre Poutines' attack on voters?
Good question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Transport.
Speaker, another day, another false allegation, another conspiracy theory. It reminds me, Mr. Speaker, of that old television show, Unsolved Mysteries. So let me solve a few for him. Who is Lene Kakua? Fake. Beyonce at the inauguration? Lip sync. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? Probably in the NDP caucus. And who made the illegal robocalls? The Liberal member for Guelph. Case closed, mystery solved.
The Honourable Member for Argenté-Papineau-Mirabel. One of my constituents wanted to get a tax return form from Revenue Canada, and she was told, go get it at your post office. Yet it's the responsibility of Revenue Canada to send out these forms. Worse still, there weren't any at her post office. And a number of times we attempted to talk to the distribution centre, but unsuccessfully. When will the Conservatives realize that their cuts to public services are making life difficult for those who only want to fill out their tax return? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, and the way that the Canadians file their taxes is changing, and we're also changing to meet those needs. CRA encourages Canadians to file online, and a growing number of Canadians are taking advantage of that safe and secure option. Good. Taxpayers can still file on paper, and tax forms remain available on request or at a local post office. So again, last year, roughly 1.3 million packages that were mailed out were never used, and I certainly think everyone can appreciate that we should not be spending money in that way. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
Mr. Speaker, our government is continuously reviewing our network of diplomatic missions abroad to ensure taxpayer dollars are respected. Canada House on Trafalgar Square in London is a historic heritage site and home of our High Commission. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs please update the House on the status of this mission?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question and the good work he does in the Canada-UK Interparliamentary Association. Canadians who have visited London may know that our High Commission enjoys a place of privilege in Canada House on Trafalgar Square. What many people may not realize is that our mission is currently split between Canada House and another aging building miles away. We will be expanding Canada House, taking over the building immediately adjacent, and consolidating the High Commission's operations in one spot. This will save taxpayers money and provide better service to Canadians. This exciting project will improve our operations in one of the world's greatest cities. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on June 15th of last year, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the City of Halifax in its case against the Government of Canada with regard to the chronic underassessment of historic sites by the federal government. This ruling has major consequences on municipal budgets. Let's take, for example, Chambly-Fort. The assessment undertaken by Public Works is 5 times lower than that done by the municipality. This is a $500,000 shortfall in terms of property tax for Chambly. What will the Conservatives do to respect this ruling and ensure that the municipalities get their fair share?
The
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for that question. Public Works and Government Services Canada provides services to all Canadians and taxpayers at the best price, and I would pleased to answer this question next week. Thank you. Honourable Member for Richmond, Orthobaska. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Human Resources went on a trip to talk about the next budget. If, as our government claims, the economy is her priority, I hope that you will listen to employers in all the regions who are condemning the pernicious effects of the ideological reform of employment insurance. As an entrepreneur in Sainte-Flavie said, Guillaume Gagnon indicated that the reform will compromise all our efforts and even slow future investments. These measures are hurting regional economies as well as entrepreneurs in our regions. Will the Minister do the right thing and cancel this reform? The Honourable Minister of Human Resources. Mr. Speaker, to help the entrepreneurs in the regions, we need to ensure that we have the skilled employees they need, and that is why, Mr. Speaker, we, with the changes to the employment insurance system, are giving more information to the unemployed with regard to available jobs in their area of expertise in their regions. And we are helping to connect them with available jobs. This will be better for the unemployed and better for employers as well as for the regions. The Honourable Member for Richmond, Orthobaska. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers don't feel that the Canadian development aid priorities reflect them. The federal government is abandoning Francophone countries with which Quebec has privileged ties. It favors countries that represent markets instead of the poorest populations. In light of this, Quebec wants and has decided to create its own development aid agency since there are no constitutional provisions preventing Quebec from funding itself humanitarian aid organizations. Is the government open to transferring to Quebec its share of the seat of funding? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, the federal government will continue to provide international aid on behalf of all Canadians,
including Quebecers, have consistently donated generously to causes they believe in and to help those less fortunate. Under our government, Canada's aid investments are achieving results in food security, in maternal and child health, and in education. Mr. Speaker, Canada will continue to assist those most vulnerable.
That concludes question period for today. See you Monday.
Order. Order. Tabling of documents. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to table in both official languages a copy of the House of Commons Journals number 48 from the first session of the 35th Parliament dated April 13th, 1994.
Introduction of government bills. Mr. Fast for Mr. Nicholson, seconded by Monsieur Paradis, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Criminal Code and the National Defence Act, Mental Disorder. This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
Mr. Fast for Mr. Nicholson, seconded by Monsieur Paradis, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill.
Read a second time at the next sitting of the House. Statements by ministers. Reports from inter-parliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétitions. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Papineau, Argenteuil. Argenteuil, Papineau, Mirabel.
I have here petitioners calling on the House of Commons to protect the water and public health of our rural communities by supporting my motion. These petitioners come from Alberta and BC, and I'm very, very glad to have their support. We do need to have some measures to help rural communities where there are septic systems that are polluting our environments and people cannot bring them up to standard. So I'm very glad to introduce this petition today. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present 30 signatures from my constituents in my riding in support of Bill C-452, an act to amend the criminal code which aims to fight sexual exploitation and human trafficking.
Presenting petitions. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all questions be allowed to stand.
Agreed? Agreed and so ordered. Orders of the day.
Government orders, Government Bills Commons, resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-52, Fair Rail Freight Service Act.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate. There are 3 minutes left for the honourable member of Châteauguay-Saint-Constance-Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before being interrupted by question period, I was talking about the reasons why sometimes economic activity is disturbed in some sectors of the economy. Unfortunately, there's no compensation by those responsible for these disturbances. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and 70% of our goods are moved by rail. If you contrast this with the $2 billion trade deficit and the competitiveness of international markets, well, at the end of the day, we cannot opt for the status quo or any half measures as proposed in Bill C-52. This situation unfortunately gives an unfair advantage to our international competitors. Our own producers must be able to deliver their goods faster, or rather, our competitors have access to quicker means of transporting their goods, something we don't have in Canada. Since 2007, Conservatives have waited before introducing this bill, and when you look at the inaction and the cutbacks of the last few years, you can conclude that the Conservatives don't understand how important our railway network is. We have given voice to the demands of shippers and the fact that they need rail service. We've done so with the help of our colleague from Trinity Spadina. Conservatives need to bring about a national transportation strategy. A better use of our rail network would have a positive impact on the quality of our environment and would greatly help to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. But if shippers cannot receive service from the two providers of railway services, they will have to use trucks, and unfortunately this will have a negative impact on the environment in our economic sectors. It seems that Conservatives are not interested in our railway system, and this is reflected in the fact that they have not invested much in our rail infrastructure. Therefore, we need to strike a balance again between, on the one hand, shippers, and on the other, our rail companies. Our position is simple. We are on the side of shippers and exporters, and we are determined that they receive the rail service they deserve and which they need. As usual, the government is on the side of big business. And in this case, there is a quasi-monopoly. The government is not protecting small and medium-sized enterprises with a bill which would have helped them compete internationally. The different sector associations have come together in order to plead for legislative changes in Canada. Therefore, I would ask the government to work in cooperation with us on the Transportation Committee in order to improve the competitiveness of our SMEs, which need better rail service. Canada's economic competitiveness depends on this. We need to do better to create jobs and become more competitive. So we will support this bill, but we ask the government to work with us, to work with the opposition, in order to improve this bill in the interest of fostering economic growth in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Rivière-du-Loup, Montmagny, Kamouraska. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. He has shown that groups that are affected by this bill also concern him. He cares about people affected by this bill. So we will support this bill, but it is not a perfect piece of legislation. And in fact, I have one concern in particular. When it comes to the arbitration process, the burden of proof will be put only on the users of the service and not on the railway companies. So I would like to know whether my colleague has as many concerns as I do with regard to the consequences of such an approach. The honourable member for Châteauguay-Saint-Constant. I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent question. In fact, this is indeed a particular area of concern for us. The arbitration process will place the burden of proof on shippers. They will have to prove that they are not getting good service from the railway companies, and this is an extra burden on small and medium-sized enterprises. And so this measure has to be improved. We'll have to study it in committee, and my colleague is right on that point. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Manicouagan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My colleague speaks to the issue as a whole, and I would like him to speak more specifically to the environmental repercussions of trucking versus transporting goods by rail. The honourable member for Châteauguay-Saint-Constant. I would like to thank my colleague for his question. Yes, indeed. Moving goods by rail is a solution which will affect the environment to a much lesser extent than transporting goods by truck. So if you move goods by rail from, rather, if you truck goods from areas that are far away, it will affect the environment. And unfortunately, smaller towns often don't have access to rail service, so companies have to move their goods by truck. And as a result, there is a greater impact on the environment. So, moving freight by rail versus moving goods through trucking, in fact, is better both for shippers and for the environment. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Montmagny, Kamouraska, Lille, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise in this chamber to speak for 10 minutes and to present the point of view of my party on Bill C-52. In my hands, I'm holding a bill which will amend the Transportation Act, and this is a government bill. I would like to make a preamble to set the scene. So this morning we are debating a government bill, and all members of Parliament in this chamber who will speak to this bill are not necessarily on the government side. There are three main reasons for this, three potential reasons, and Canadians might not be aware of this. Canadians watching on CPAC, the opposition works very hard and uses all of its resources to study legislation. In our party, we have many young members of Parliament who are willing and able to work long and hard. It seems that there is a disdain on the part of some government members for bills proposed by the government, and this disdain reflects badly on the work of MPs. We are a parliament. When we are here on Parliament Hill, we are paid. We are well paid to do the job of parliamentarians. So, when a bill as important as this one is to the Canadian economy is tabled by a government, and which members of that government cannot be bothered to rise in the House to explain the position of their own government, it reminds me of the time the current Prime Minister, who will only be Prime Minister for 2 more years, when this Prime Minister a few years ago said in an interview after he had prorogued Parliament that it was better for the country when Parliament was not in session, and the Prime Minister was actually serious when he said this. He said that it's better for the economy when Parliament is not sitting. So for us, this is an eloquent example of the deep disdain the government has for the work carried out by parliamentarians. In any modern piece of legislation, there are always regulations. Many members of the current government are closet libertarians. In fact, the Conservative Party might be called the Libertarian Party of Canada. They believe that the invisible hand of the market is a magic bullet for any problem. However, we don't buy into that idea. And I would like members opposite to show me examples in the world where a libertarian system made life better for everyone. Personally, I don't believe that ever happened. So a modern piece of legislation has to strike a balance between buyers and sellers, people who need a service and people who offer a service. But when you're in a situation where there is a quasi-monopoly or a duopoly, which is the case of credit cards or rail service in this country, it is a situation where a couple of huge companies offer a service to millions of consumers. So it's impossible to think that in a situation which is so unbalanced that the invisible hand of the market will be the solution for everything. And therefore, it is the duty of members of Parliament to strike a balance and to ensure that the system is fair, that the system works in favor not for a couple of big companies, but for everyone in the country, including millions of consumers. So let's come back more specifically to the bill, which is at issue today, which we are debating in the House today, Bill C-52. I would like to say that I and my party will support Bill C-52 despite its weaknesses, and we will do so on behalf of the rural areas of this country. It's a small step in the right direction. It's half a step in the right direction, rather in a direction which is not necessarily the right one, but more or less in the right direction, because it is going to help companies which work in the natural resource sector to transport their goods in a more effective manner. It's not a perfect bill, but it is good enough, and we will support it. So what we are dealing with is a duopoly, and this has created a ridiculous situation. 70% of our primary resources are transported by rail, by two railway companies, 70%. 80% of the customers are not satisfied with the rail service they receive. It is or rather, it doesn't make sense that these people are complaining without reason. Now, what are the consequences to the situation? Some suppliers are unable to reach clear and reliable agreements with these railway companies, and this has repercussions on their agreements with other companies abroad. So, as a result, often suppliers face delays, and this leads to catastrophic situations. Let me repeat this. There are situations in which there are disturbances for suppliers because the rail transportation system is highly inadequate in this country.
So there are hundreds and millions of dollars in losses of inefficiencies. There's also a lack of availability. So there are tons of freight, for example, that is supposed to go to China, and they are unable to sell their products, not because there is no demand, not because they are unable to respond to demand, but because the link between Fermont and Lachine has been slowed down because of poor rail service. So once again, how can we attach figures to this kind of global loss? Let's talk about a very troubling aspect of the Conservatives' approach. They spend a great deal of time on botching free trade agreements. And then they say, quick, let's sign all these agreements. So it's completely botched, and because it's all about quantity, not quality. But in the meantime, they don't make any efforts to ensure that our Canadian businesses, within a credit card system, within a R&D program that would allow it to remain competitive. So despite all the genius of our Canadian businessmen, they don't help them be competitive, but they open markets here and there with bungled agreements. So what they must do to allow people to be competitive is simply not done by the Conservatives. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that our trade deficit is rising to the tune of $2 billion. Oh, 1 minute? Are you serious? I'm only halfway through my speech. All right, I'll try and go twice as fast. So this bill is imperfect, but because there was so much pressure exerted by one of our colleagues who tabled a bill on the protection of rail passengers. Now, that was a clear bill and was addressed to people who are stuck with this problem. As I said earlier, this is a weak bill, especially with regard to arbitration, because it reverses the onus onto the shippers. And in addition, I read it because I did read this bill. I did my parliamentary duty. There's a paragraph that says that arbitration has to be agreed to by both parties. So a large company could say, well, I don't want any arbitration. They could say, well, it's going to go to court. So a small business will find itself in court against a large company. So we could have lots of situations like that. So we're going to support this bill, but we hope that it will be improved in committee. Thank you. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Châteauguay-Saint-Constant. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech and for his interest in rail service. I think that must be an important issue in his riding as well. He asked a question. He asked me a question about arbitration, but he didn't have time to get into it. And I'd like to hear more of what he has to say about the advantages that small businesses will have when faced with a giant such as CN or CP. I'd like to hear him explain in more detail why small companies will be at a disadvantage. The honourable member for Montmagny, Lillec, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague. I'll be able to be more precise with this. There are two aspects to the problem. The fees within the arbitration process will be paid by both parties, but once again, I repeat, we're talking about two gigantic companies that will be pitted against small companies that have that have far less resources. And I'm going to read the paragraph, section 61. Something subject to a confidential contract is subject to the consent of both parties to the contract. So people will go into arbitration, but what happens if a large company says no? Well, then they'll have to go to court, and then the fees are astronomical. If an enormous company like CN does not want to go to arbitration on an issue that might harm it, well, we know how it's going to end. It's going to take years and even decades because they have enough money to drag the question out. Whereas small businesses, it won't be fair for small businesses. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his impassioned speech, the kind that he always gives. It is great to see him get up and defend the people in his riding, and we see that in the work that he does every day. Unfortunately, my colleague ran out of time before he could say everything that he wanted to say about this bill, so I would like to give him the opportunity to expand a little bit and to wrap up on what he wanted to say, because we know, unfortunately, in this House, we don't have as much time as we would like always to expound upon our ideas and our opinions and those of our constituents. The honourable member for Montmagny, Lillec, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague because, yes, I did want to come back to something very important. The general underdevelopment of rail services in this country. We missed a historic opportunity in 2008-2009. For example, South Korea invested an immense percentage of billions of dollars in order to relaunch rail services. Why? Because they killed, I would say, 3 birds with one stone, because they created more jobs. And then number 2, with regard to its credit rating, they invested in their own inventory. They didn't squander it on programs, how can I put this, that are not always productive in the long term. The South Koreans now have a very high-performance rail link that they can offer to their citizens. If we had even 1/10 of the wisdom of the Koreans, but we would have done the same, but not with the Conservatives in power. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Manicouagan.
Monsieur le Président, j'aborderai cette allocution portant sur le transport ferroviaire.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to address this bill from a point of view of the importance of expanding rail service and improving it with regard to environmental and social aspects. Now, I'm going to inject some comments of a personal nature, as I usually do, and I'm going to talk about the industrial rise that we're seeing in my riding. Now I know that parliamentarians who follow the news, they will know that there is a mining boom underway in my riding of Maniquagan, an unprecedented boom. And if we look at iron development, but also hydroelectric development. Now, Mr. Speaker, despite what was announced by the different levels of government, freight transport is mostly done by road. So large trucks that transport freight to work sites, well, it must be understood that between Quebec City and Sept-Îles or Natashquan, because the 138 ends at Natashquan, and there are many work sites along that route, well, the distance is about 1,000 kilometers between Quebec and Natashquan, or else you can take the route through the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region, because the 138 hooks up with that region, and so that is available for a cargo transport as well. Now, we must understand that 138 is in a very poor condition, and not because no funds were invested in its repair, but because of these semi-trailers and trucks that use that route, and it is 14 hours of transport for me. And so it is very difficult for me when I take my car, and there are measures that are put forward every year, but the semi-trailers and trucks really damage this road despite the money invested. So they don't do a lot for the maintenance of Route 138. Now, it is very risky to take 138 because citizens who use Route 138 must deal with these huge trucks and with the very difficult weather conditions. And we often see in media that there are accidents that involve these semi-trailers. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, doesn't happen every week, but it has happened enough times for me to raise it today. So, environmentally speaking, it is difficult with regard to GHG emissions, but also for public safety. There are concerns that should be brought to the attention of Canadians at large. Now, Mr. Speaker, during my speech, I will mention the three major rail carriers in my riding. Now, they are private, though. There is a Quebec HoC Mining, which is located in Port-Cartier, and it has a rail service. And there is also a QNSL. It is owned by Rio Tinto, and it also has a rail service. And there is also Chihuahuan Rail Company, which provides passenger transport to Shefferville, but it also transports iron ore. Now, with regard to Quebec HoC Mining, it goes from Port-Cartier to Fermont. QNSL goes to Wabush, and Chihuahuan, which is the third largest passenger rail service after CN&CB, goes to Shefferville, but it must use some of the railway that belongs to QNSL. Now, They are thinking of putting in place a railway between Bécomo and Paul Cartier, and this rail service would be good for my riding. The contribution of rail and marine transport would make for less problems with regard to road transport and eliminate some of the problems related to road transport on the 138. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is very important here in my own riding, and this is my personal opinion, but it is also shared by specialists in the industry, is that the different modes of transport should be combined, whether it be a maritime transport, rail transport, and truck transport. All these things should be combined to make the whole system more effective and efficient and not put any more pressure on the road system. Announcements were made with regard to the La Romaine project, and so the idea would be to use maritime shipping for La Romaine, but we're waiting in Havre-Saint-Pierre to see whether that is actually going to happen, because that's not the case right now. As I said, they are still using road transport for freight. Now they also transport prefabricated houses, so really the route 138 is very difficult to travel on for 7 or 10 or 14 hours if you're going all the way to Natashquan. It can be very difficult if you have to pass or run or come into contact with one of these large vans that is transporting a house. Now, Mr. Speaker, obviously, all of this means that for the federal authorities and the government authorities, it is very important to invest in the improvement of the railway network, and it should not only be these private companies that benefit from this monopoly, because competitors, for example, a Chewitten rail company, I was told that they had to pay $50,000 per trip, and because they are forced to use the QNSL's rail portions. So currently, there is no competition that is tolerated on railway networks that are put into place by a given company. And that is why it is very important for the government to invest to ensure that all users can benefit from the infrastructure in place and to benefit from rail service in general. The industrial rise in Manicouagan and the increased international investment in mining justifies more government involvement in railway services in order to make the infrastructure a national asset that could be made available to all sectors of industry. Now, we've heard of many foreign investments, and all these foreign partners are coming to the North Shore and in my riding of Manicouagan and if they wanted to build their own railway network, well then, and I think that many other partners share this opinion, it would be more efficient to share the infrastructure and share the rail network that already exists, given the long life cycle. Now, should road transport be given precedence as the #1 form of transport? Well, perhaps the oil lobby thinks that, but that is something else that was brought to my attention, because I was told that at a certain time, not long ago in Quebec, there was an excellent railway network, and it was all dismantled over during the 1990s. This is what I said, and I submit this as your humble servant. Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As member for Drummond, I would like to first thank and commend my colleague on his speech. It was a very good speech, and he did mention the fact that it is very important for climate change and for the environment to give precedence to railroads. This is a type of transport that was foundational for Canada, and it is something that has been neglected lately. And we know that the Conservative government has turned its back on our infrastructure, has not invested sufficiently in public transit, and our railroads are a clear example of that. And I think that I would ask my honourable colleague to tell us how important the railway network is with regard to the environment and with regard to the fact that much more emphasis could be put on the rail service by the government so we could have better transport services. The honourable member for Manicouagan. I would like to thank my colleague for his question. And what we are seeing, Mr. Speaker, is simply they're pushing blindly ahead with private railways, private sector railway networks. When I talk about Chihuahua, which provides passenger transit, well, that's in partnership with the Innu of Nescapi, which is a great thing, and that's why I want to underscore that great initiative today. But it is a private sector initiative, so that's a problem. Because with regard of the environmental impact of road transport, well, obviously it's visible. You should see how dirty my car is after I travel on the 138 and come into contact with semi-trailers and large trucks. The emissions are much higher than the standard allowed. So we need to see a true commitment on the part of the federal authorities to invest in the implementation of an adequate railway network. Perhaps it is not as relevant for the portion between Quebec and Sept-Îles, but there are other pieces of the portions of the 138 that could truly benefit from 138. Questions and comments, the honourable member for Compton-Stansted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague clearly explained the situation in his region with regard to the not the merger, but the idea of using all modes of transport to ship freight to remote regions. I would like to hear more of what he has to say on what would be acceptable, especially environmentally speaking, and with regard to our economic reality and the reality in his region with regard to intermodal transport. The honourable member for Manicouagan. I would like to thank my colleague for his question. Now, we have to be relevant. It has been said that maritime transport would be used in my region, so we're waiting to see if this lip service is actually going to be applied. Announcements have been made with regard to La Romaine, so I would say that the St. Lawrence River is underused for the transport of freight, and that would remove considerable pressure from Route 138, which is considerably damaged. I have a 2012 vehicle, and it's been severely damaged because of the condition of the road, and I travel back and forth on it. So I would argue that an increased use of the St. Lawrence River for maritime transport of freight and cargo would be an excellent idea. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak on Bill C-52, an act to amend the Canada Transportation Act Administration, Air and Railway Transportation Arbitration. I'd like to start off by saying that we will be supporting the bill at second reading, even if the bill has some flaws. In fact, Mr. Speaker, 80% of the rail freight service customers, in fact, the shippers, are not satisfied with the services provided. They're asking the government to take action and to present legislative measures to get CNNCP to enter into agreements and contracts with them. This is a beginning. It's a first step. However, it's not a panacea. On the contrary, shippers have difficulty getting fair and reliable services. A certain number of them can't even get contracts with large rail companies, and some of them who are subject to significant delays or don't have enough cars available to them. Conservatives finally tabled this bill to deal with a certain number of these problems after the NDP critics bill was introduced last spring, an act to protect consumers and railway companies. In fact, some good work was done in this regard with regard to public transit, and in fact we have suggested a national public transit strategy, and this policy should be extended to the Conservatives. Unfortunately, they're turning a deaf ear still, and it would be preferable for them to listen to the good ideas regarding public transit. And earlier when I was asking a question of my honourable colleague from Manicouagan, I was told this is what built Canada. This is what helped to create Canada. It's essential to Canada. Unfortunately, for some time now, services have been cut, investments in infrastructure have stopped, and the legislation is toothless in terms of getting people to invest more in these railway lines. And as my colleague from Manicouagan said, the roads are heavily used, too heavily used in fact, and we could use other means of transportation such as the railway. And this would help us to save our roads, which are used so much they are falling apart. But also it will be more efficient because the railway is very good for the environment. In fact, Bill C-52 was a first step in the right direction, as I said, but it's far from being perfect since significant demands by the shippers have remained unanswered. It's ambiguous and could create some loopholes. The NDP wants to get some amendments put forward in committee in order to prevent abuses, to ensure that service agreements are put in place and in the right way, and to ensure that we can avoid conflicts. You know, unfortunately, freight services are currently not very good services, and it costs a lot of money. In fact, often the shippers have to deal with lost rotten crops because of delays or other poor conditions. This is undermining Canadian exporters and Canadian companies in terms of their ability to compete, and it's also costing us jobs. As I indicated, Mr. Speaker, the railway should be something that is used more frequently, and in order to do this, we have to ensure that it is efficient and in good condition. In my region of Greater Drummond, the railway is important to industry, but it's not yet used as much as it could be. And if we had a railway that was more efficient, more available, and safer, or more reliable, I'm sure that companies in my region would use it even more, and we would be winners in other aspects at other levels in terms of our ability to compete and in terms of improving the environment. The Conservatives did not do everything they needed to do in terms of infrastructure. They haven't sufficiently funded our infrastructure, and because of this, we are currently seeing a huge deficit in terms of quality, and the rail system is one example of this. The Conservatives' bill is very weak because these protective measures don't cover existing contracts between shippers and railway companies, and only offers a limited arbitration process with regard to negotiations that don't result in new contracts. It's important to keep in mind that we need a more global vision, as I mentioned earlier. The railway is essential to Canada's economy. 70% of our goods are shipped by rail, so it's essential for rail services to benefit our companies and our shippers. So the cost of rail freight services is also undermining Canadian companies. C-52 specifically excludes the issue of tariffs or rates. And some shippers also. There's also Canada's trade deficit, which continues to rise, Mr. Speaker. It hit $2 billion in November 2012, Mr. Speaker, and this is according to Statistics Canada. This means, and this is a proof of the Conservatives' failure, not only do they have the largest deficit in the history of Canada with their budgets under the Conservative government, but furthermore, we also have a trade deficit that once again is proof of their failure all along the line when it comes to the economy. And the fact that they have not taken care of rail transportation is a further proof of their failure. As I mentioned earlier, 70% of our goods are shipped by rail. So we should have a lot more. We should give a lot more consideration for the rail infrastructure and have a vision. And as I mentioned earlier, the train is something that is historic. It is historic for Canada. The railway has a historic role in the development of Canada. All companies that want to ensure that they have a long-term vision, invest in rail infrastructure. And we, for a long time, have been asking for a national strategy on public transit that would include, among other things, the railways. And unfortunately, once again, the Conservative government here has not done its job recently. I'm just going to go a little bit outside of C-52. If I can give an aside, Mr. Speaker, recently the Environment Commissioner came out with his latest report, and I want to thank the Honourable Mr. Vaughan for all the work that he has done. As you know, it's his last report. He did excellent work for Canada and for the environment. And among other things, he mentioned all the support, financial support, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, almost $1 billion a year, that continue to be given by the Conservative government to the coal, oil and gas industries. So when we could transfer that money to, in fact, invest in a national policy on transportation, and this is extremely important when we think of public transit, but also the transportation of freight, and we have to review this vision. Everything is interrelated. We're talking about transportation. It's related to the environment. It's related to our economy, and this is really important to remember. Unfortunately, the Conservative government has already demonstrated it with its largest deficit in the history of Canada, with a trade deficit of $2 billion in November, according to Statistics Canada, and with failure to invest in infrastructure, with 80% of shippers who are not satisfied with the work that is being done by railway companies. So this means that there is a failure by the Conservatives, and the NDP has to take over to ensure that there is a vision, an overall vision, a national vision, a national strategy on transportation, and this will help the economy, the environment, and of course it will also help the area of transportation in general. On that note, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you, and I would be pleased now to answer questions. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a number of farmers in the municipality of St. Cloud and St. Polycarp, and they would like to have affordable rates in order to be able to use the railway and transport their goods. Perhaps the members in the House don't know this, but Vaudreuil-Soulanges is crossed by two railway lines, Canadian Pacific as well as Canadian National. And our region is really a hub, if you will, for the entire country when it comes to the transportation of goods. And I can tell you that farmers have been disappointed by the steps taken or not taken by this government not to improve rates in the rail sector. Can my colleague perhaps talk a little bit about the challenges that farmers face in these times, because we are experiencing a difficult economy internationally? The Honourable Member for Drummond. I want to thank my honourable colleague from Vaudreuil-Soulanges for that question. As I mentioned in my speech, this is further proof of the Conservatives' failure in this bill. We will support the bill, but unfortunately we'll have to improve things. And one of those things, in fact, is that we see that no action is being taken on the rates, and this is a problem because if we really want to allow the use of the railway, if we really want to allow farmers in his region to be able to use the railway, well, of course, then we need to have rates that are affordable, that are accessible, and that will allow, of course, improvements to occur. If there are more affordable rates and we take heavy trucks off the road, we'll be able to improve our roads, our economy, our environment, and the railway is the way of the future, as I said earlier, and I think that C-52 is a first step, but is not enough, unfortunately, and the Conservatives don't have the Conservatives to go all the way when it comes to the rates.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, and Kapuskasing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rail transportation is not the only issue that the Conservatives have not taken action on. They put in place new rail security measures, and they have prevented high-speed trains from operating in Canada. Canadians deserve more. When we look at this, Mr. Speaker, the importance of this network, it's extremely important, particularly for our rural regions and Northern Ontario, and I can tell you that in North Bay, among other places, throughout, in Kapuskasing even, it's really an important issue, be it for goods or for passengers. So I would like to ask my colleague if he could perhaps explain further the benefits for manufacturers, as well as if there are more benefits to having people traveling on rail, if there are more passenger trains and trains that are the ability to have to transport more goods. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for that question, which is extremely relevant. And in her preamble, she explained well the situation, and that is why, once again, I want to come back to the strategy that I was talking about, the national transportation strategy that our critic on public transit had brought forward. She introduced a bill on that subject, and I hope the Conservatives will look at it because, in fact, it is a global vision that is required. We're talking about investing in infrastructure. It's a vision to invest in our economy. It's a vision to invest in regional economy in the regions. It's also a vision to ensure that we protect the environment and the protection of our roads. They won't be as worn. This will be beneficial for all, and I think that the honourable colleague clearly demonstrated the situation, and I think that this is just one thing. We have to have, this bill is just one step. We have to have a global vision. We in the NDP do have a more global vision, and that includes the economy, the environment, and a strategy for transportation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate. Resuming debate. Is the House ready for the question? Yes, the question is as follows.
Seconded by Mr. O'Connor, move that Bill C-52, an act to amend the Canada Transportation Act, Administration, Air and Railway Transportation and Arbitration, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Committees. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. Yes? Agreed? Carried.
Lecture de ce projet de loi, third reading.
Third reading of this bill.
Accordingly, the bill stands deferred to the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. The Honourable Government Chief Government Whip is rising at point of order.
See the clock at 1:30.
The Chief Government Whip asked for consent to see the clock at 1:30. Agreed? Agreed, and so ordered. Orders of the day.
Private members' business. Debate at third reading on Bill C-383, Transboundary Waters Protection Act, standing in the name of Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller, seconded by Mr. Allison, moves that Bill C-383, an act to amend the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act and the International River Improvements Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate. The honourable member for Bruce, Grey, Owen Sound.
Hear, hear, hear. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm extremely pleased today to be able to rise to begin third reading debate on my private member's bill, the Transboundary Waters Protection Act. Since its introduction just over a year ago, we have had both fulsome, positive debate at second reading and again at the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. I would like to thank all members of this House, and specifically those on the committee, for their contributions to the debate. I am hopeful that we will soon see this bill enacted. The strong support that C-383 has received thus far reflects the opinion of the vast majority of Canadians who strongly oppose the bulk removal of water from Canada's freshwater basins. Mr. Speaker, this is something that I hear continuously from my constituents, family, friends, and from my colleagues here in the House on all sides. This is an issue that I believe unites us as parliamentarians. Indeed, it is rare to have an issue that is so clearly one-sided in a country as large and diverse as Canada. Canadians want to know that their federal and provincial governments will take the necessary steps to prevent bulk removals of water from ever happening. And why? Because not only do bulk water removals pose a significant threat to ecosystems, but water is also an important component in the fight against invasive species. By removing a potential pathway for these species, we can help prevent the devastation that their movement between basins could cause. When I was before the Foreign Affairs Committee in October, I made the comment that no bill is ever perfect. All along, I have been open to ways in which this legislation could be strengthened, which is why I would like to briefly explain one amendment that was made to C-383 in committee, an amendment that I believe makes it a stronger bill. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the addition of, in brackets, purpose clauses to the sections of the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act and the International River Improvements Act that contain the bulk water removal provisions. In my view, these clauses clearly articulate that the purpose of these bulk water removal provisions is to prevent the potential harm that they could cause to Canadian ecosystems and to reinforce our desire to prevent harm to the environment. As most members know by now, Bill C-383 amends the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act to prevent transboundary waters, those that flow across the boundary, with the same protections that are currently in place for boundary waters, those waters that straddle the border. And speaking of that, I live on one of the Great Lakes, Mr. Speaker, and that water also borders on the United States, and I know exactly where we're coming from on that. Well, the provinces have laws, regulations, or policies in place to prevent the bulk removal of waters from their territories. Our hope is that with C-383, we will enhance protections at both the federal and provincial levels. Rest assured, we will continue to work with the provinces to ensure that these waters are protected. The second amendment provided for in C-383 is an amendment to the International River Improvements Act, which prohibits the issuing of a license for an international river improvement that would link waters that are neither boundary nor transboundary with an international river, if doing so would increase the annual flow of the international river at the boundary. This specific provision will ensure that an international river is not used as a conveyance or a pathway to move water in bulk outside of Canada. This last amendment was a recommendation from water experts from the Program on Water Issues at the Monk School of Global Affairs in Toronto. In fact, testifying before the Standing Committee on October 25th, these same water experts voiced their support for C-383, stating that the goal of protecting Canada's water resources from bulk export is significantly accomplished by way of this proposed legislation. End of quote. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Monk School experts for their role over the years in the Canadian water policy debates, and especially for the assistance they have provided to me on this bill. Next, Mr. Speaker, C-383 moves some definitions and exceptions from the regulations of the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act into the Act itself. As has been touched upon in previous debates, moving definitions and exceptions into the Act will entrench key definitions such as what constitutes the removal of water in bulk. These exceptions allow for the removal of water temporarily for emergency or humanitarian purposes, such as firefighting, but not for commercial purposes. These exceptions are reasonable and are not inconsistent with the purpose of the bulk water prohibition. And now that these definitions and exceptions are to be moved into the body of the Act, any changes would have to be approved by Parliament. This provides members of this House with much greater oversight. Mr. Speaker, during committee consideration of C-383, there was some discussion about the definition of bulk removal. In the bill, bulk removal is removing water from boundary or transboundary waters and taking it outside the Canadian portion of the water basin in which it is located. If the means of diversion includes canals, tunnels, pipelines, or other channels, for example, any removal is prohibited. In other words, any attempt to transfer even a drop of water outside the basin of a boundary or transboundary water using a canal or some kind of channel would be prohibited. By other means, one cannot take more than 50,000 litres outside the basin per day. Some members of the committee were concerned that this was a potential loophole in the legislation. And I want to be clear that this is not a loophole, and that even though 50,000 litres seems like a large number, it is no larger than a tanker truck or your average residential swimming pool. As such, this cannot be considered a bulk removal and, in fact, could not be considered economically feasible. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to address another area of the bill raised at committee regarding manufactured products containing water. As the bill states, bulk removal does not include the taking of a manufactured product that contains water outside the water basin. This includes water and other beverages in bottles or containers. This is included to ensure the legitimate commerce, such as the products of breweries, soft drinks, juice, or even bottled water manufacturers, are not interfered with. My goal in introducing this legislation, and I believe the goal of others in this House, is to remove the threat of bulk removals of water and not prevent breweries and other manufacturers from selling their fine products around the globe. Mr. Speaker, finally, I would like to take a minute or two to highlight the deterrence aspect of Bill C-383. C-383 proposes amendments to strengthen the enforcement authorities, fines, and sentencing provisions of the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act. These amendments include mandatory minimum fines for designated offences and increased maximum fines for all offences. For instance, violations of this Act can result in a fine of up to $1 million for an individual and up to $6 million for a corporation for a first offence. In addition, these fines are cumulative, meaning that every day the violation occurs is considered a separate violation, so fine totals can increase very rapidly. I believe that this in itself provides a strong deterrence against even contemplating violating the terms of this Act. And added to this, there is also the potential for further fines under this Act. C-383 contains provisions that would allow the courts to add increased fines for aggravating factors such as damage to the environment. Mr. Speaker, as members know, my riding of Bruce Grey Owen Sound is nestled between Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, and my riding is surrounded basically on three sides by waters that come under this Act. It is an area where we have some of the greatest sources of water in this country, Coming from this part of the country, I have a deep appreciation for Canada's water resources. And although water seems abundant and everlasting, I do not, and we should not, take this resource for granted. I understand that we as Ontarians, we as Canadians, must be responsible stewards of our water. I want to ensure that this resource remains protected for my grandchildren, for my great-grandchildren, and for generations into the future. I introduced Bill C-383 in order to play a small part in protecting Canada's water. We all agree that potential harm to Canada's water from bulk removals is just too great to ignore. I urge all members of the House to vote for this measure. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Drummond.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I carefully listened to the speech given by my honourable colleague. Of course, Bill C-383 is the first step, but it is not enough. It doesn't go far enough. In fact, we within the NDP have been asked for a long time to ask for a national policy, something bigger than what is presented here, something that would take into account all of the aspects regarding water in Canada. We would also ask for a review of NAFTA and its provisions with regard to bulk water removal. I would ask my honourable colleague what would be important for him with regard to a national water policy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly thank my honourable colleague across the way for his question, and I'm sure that he agrees in principle with this bill that protecting our waters is the right way to go. But respectfully, I have to point out that the member's trying to confuse and throw into the mix a bunch of different issues. This is a national bill. It covers transboundary waters. Now, I don't want to put words in the member's mouth, but it appears like he's implying that we should get into provincial jurisdictions. And I know from experience that if we were to do that or try to do it, first of all, it isn't necessary because they're covered by the provinces and the territories. But secondly, we would have, provinces like Alberta or Quebec. They would be the first ones to stand up and say, get out of our jurisdiction. So to that, this bill, I think, covers it very well. And the issue that he's trying to do is basically not really part of this at all.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Lac Saint Louis.
I would just like to follow up a bit on my colleague's question and ask the honourable member what the government would do if a province lifted its current prohibition on exporting water and decided, for example, a province like Newfoundland decided that it would lift its moratorium, its prohibition, and allow tanker ships to take water from Lake Gisborne to another country. Would his bill prevent this?
The honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Well, I'd like to first of all, thank the member for his question, but the member from Lac Saint Louis, his work on this same issue, we had a little bit of disagreement on how we get to an end, but I think we both have the same purpose, and I thank him for that. But, when you throw out what if, what if the Ottawa River stopped flowing tomorrow? Well, we'll deal with that when it comes, And I think that the reality of it is, what province or territory, Mr. Speaker, is going to go and I think that their taxpayers and ratepayers would be up in arms if they ever went and took away those controls and protections that protected their water. So I think it's not a valid fear at all, and that's all I'm going to comment on it.
Questions and comments. Time for a short question. The honourable member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know the honourable member is a great outdoorsman, a lover of God's natural resources. It's been presented to us, both fish and wildlife. And I know that he mentioned in his speech the protection of invasive species, that his private member's bill might go a long way to helping to ensure that we are able to keep them at bay. And I wonder if he could talk about that and plus anything else that he finds pertinent.
The honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound, short answer, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I want to thank my colleague and member here for a great question. And yes, the member and I both share a very strong love for the outdoors, and including fishing. And invasive species is something that this government has dealt with in a number of ways. You know, with international shipping and what have you. You know, species have come in here in the past that have done long-term damage, and we've tried to create some laws and enforcement that reduces that. I mean, there's always risk on some of these, but we have to do everything that we can, not just as a government, but as individuals, and continue that. And on diversions and channels was one of the things that I talked about in my speech. Everyone knows about the diversion that goes out of the south end of Lake Michigan through Chicago, which eventually goes into the Mississippi. And we've been very fortunate in this country so far to keep the famous or infamous Asian carp out of there. But those are the types of things that we have to go towards protecting, and I think this bill will do that.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Drummond. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to speak today to Bill C-383, an act amending the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act and the International River Improvements Act. First, I will begin by saying that the NDP will support this bill, despite its many weaknesses. First, the purpose of the bill is to amend the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act to prohibit the bulk removal of transboundary waters and to improve current protections. The bill applies to all transboundary waters between Canada and the U.S. and water which flows from Canada to the U.S. and rivers which also flow into the U.S. And unless I'm mistaken, the Saint François River in the riding of Drummond is also covered by the bill. So, in fact, it's a bill which is very close to my heart because, as you know, water is one of the greatest natural resources in the world. It is an unbelievable resource, and water, in fact, should be a human right. In fact, it is, according to the UN National Assembly. In June 2010, with a vast majority, the UN voted that water was a human right. As well, drinking water, clean drinking water, is essential to the survival of human beings. Any danger to clean water, of course, is a real threat to human beings. So, of course, Canada is a country which has massive water resources. We have rivers and lakes and streams, and we must protect our waters. We must protect our waters with a national water policy which also contains vision. After promises made by successive Conservative governments, we finally have a bill. However, the government did not attack the greatest threat to our water, which is the bulk removal of water which is not transboundary water. That is the bulk removal of other fresh water towards the United States. So even though Bill C-383 is a step in the right direction, as I said earlier, it's clear that it does not prohibit all massive or bulk removals of water. My honourable colleague said that this bill does contain weaknesses and that it might not prohibit bulk removal of water, and this is something that we will fight against because, of course, we are completely against the bulk removal of our waters. So we want to make sure that protecting all surface waters will be regulated. We want to regulate, for instance, the removal of water by containers. And we want to make sure that there are protections in NAFTA. We want a coordinated plan between provinces to implement this prohibition of bulk water removal. We want binational agreements with the United States to prevent the U.S. from acting unilaterally to import waters. We want to regulate exemptions, which would allow for the removal of water, bottled water. So, in fact, what we're dealing with here is not only international boundary waters. The greater issue here is the protection of all Canadian waters. And we want the Conservative government to realize that water is a very important asset to us. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that the Conservative government recognizes this. We have small pieces of legislation, and the Conservatives are only taking tiny baby steps, but these steps are not connected to a greater vision. They have not presented us with a larger vision. A little earlier, we debated rail freight service, but there again, there was a lack of a global vision, and the same thing is happening here. The NDP has an overall vision on what a national water policy should be, which would prevent the bulk water removal.
And NAFTA has long been considered a threat with regard to the water sovereignty of Canada. In February 1999, after a debate in the House of Commons, the House of Commons adopted an NDP motion concerning the immediate imposition of a moratorium on the export of bulk quantities of fresh water and on watershed transfers. It called upon the government to present a legislative measure to ban bulk water exports and specify that the federal government should not enter into any international agreement that would oblige us to export fresh water against our will. So as you can see, Mr. Speaker, we have been working on this for a very long time. The NDP has been working on this area for a very long time, and we have been calling for a ban on massive exports of bulk water. And so we are really the pioneers in this regard, and we need a national water strategy. That is what is very important. Also, Mr. Speaker, I would like to talk about a recent report produced by the Environment Commissioner, Mr. Vaughan, who made public his report last week. I would like to thank Mr. Vaughan once again. I did it earlier, but I want to thank him again for the excellent work he does for Canadians. And as Environment Commissioner, and in his recent report on the environment, he mentioned that with regard to shale gas, the federal government is not doing its job because according to Environment Canada and Health Canada, according to the Canada Environmental Protection Act of 1999, it is the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that Canadians' health and their environment is protected from chemicals. As you know, right now, the federal government does not require the obligatory disclosure of the chemicals used by shale gas fracking companies. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, this is something very serious indeed, because despite what they would have us believe, imagine that there are 600 shale gas wells consume the equivalent of 360,000 Olympic pools of water mixed with 900 Olympic pools of chemicals. So when we say that it is just a bit of chemicals that is injected into the ground, well, they forget to say that it is mixed with an enormous quantity of water, and this represents an enormous quantity of chemicals. And the government, once again, the Conservative government, has failed in protecting our water because it does not require obligatory disclosure of the chemicals used in fracking for shale gas wells. I am very proud of the position of our leader of the official opposition, the NDP, who is calling upon the Conservative government that chemicals should be the object of obligatory disclosure, but unfortunately the Conservatives are sitting on their hands and are not doing anything in that regard, whereas this is a threat for the environment and for Canadians' health. In fact, the Environment Commissioner said that this does not abide by the Sustainable Development Act, which contains the notion of the precautionary principle. And what this means is that when there is doubt, when there are risks that Canadians' health or the environment may be threatened, well then, precautions must be taken in this regard. And if at least the Conservative government forced companies to disclose which chemicals they are using, then we could do a proper analysis. We could have appropriate standards and rules in place to regulate shale gas so that its development can be done in an environmentally responsible manner and in respect of Canadians' health. But we're completely in the dark with regard to the government's actions. Mr. Speaker, you may say that I've talked about shale gas quite a bit. Well, it's because something that interests me. And with regard to my honourable colleague's bill, there is no national water policy in place, and that is something that is sorely lacking. We need a broader vision, a more global vision of water. Water is a human right that has been recognized by the UN, so we need a national water strategy, a national water policy that is strong, that allows us to protect our environment and human health. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Lac Saint-Louis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in this House today to announce that the Liberal caucus will be supporting this bill. And we support it because we were behind this push to encourage the government to table measures regarding this threat. Now, this is more of a threat to the future than it is right now, because currently there is no major threat with regard to the exports of Canada's freshwater, but this is a threat that will grow in future. And we thus urge the government to introduce measures in accordance with what was proposed by the Munk Centre of the University of Toronto. That is, a mainly environmental approach that would have banned transfers of water from watershed to watershed, and by the same token would have ensured that we could have exported water, because to export water in massive quantities, of course, it has to go from watershed to watershed to get to another country, mainly the United States. So we will support this bill because we want to convey the message that we are against the idea of exporting fresh water from Canada across our borders. Now, that being said, this bill has a great many flaws. And when I asked my question earlier, the member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound said that there's no use talking about hypothetical situations when I raised the idea that a business person might want to export water from Lake Gisborne in Newfoundland using a tanker to another country. And that is not a hypothetical situation, because it's already happened. A business person, a local business person in Newfoundland and Labrador, had even signed a contract with another country specifying a situation which was exactly the one I described. And the Premier of the Newfoundland at the time, the Honourable Brian Tobin, decided to impose a moratorium and to cancel that contract. So it's not a hypothetical situation, not at all. And the member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound also said if a province decided to lift the moratorium on the export of water, well, then there would be an outcry, and the public would rise up against the government. Now, I think that is true today, but in the future, you never know. Who knows whether a province, perhaps if it's strapped for cash, might think that it would be a good idea to export its water and to use the revenues to fund their education system or their healthcare system. So we might envision the fact that public opinion could change. And I would add that in Quebec, the chair of the College of Specialized Physicians, I can't remember his name, but he is in favor of exporting fresh water from Quebec to fund the healthcare system. So public opinion can easily change overnight, in fact, depending on what kind of campaign is launched to promote a given idea. I'm going to leave that aside to come back to the fact that there are many flaws in this bill, and my colleague from Drummond raised a few of those. It does not ban the exports of water in bulk quantities on tankers. It does not exclude the possibility of exporting water from rivers that flow into coastal areas, such as BC, that are exported by tankers or by floating bags. And I doubt also whether this bill, even though my colleague might say the opposite, I doubt that this bill will ban the transport of water across the Canada-U.S. border via pipelines. The government claims that this bill addresses transboundary rivers or transborder rivers. And I'm not sure that it is the case that there would be a ban on pipelines, and I'd like to quote an expert on this, Mr. J. Owen Saunders, who works with the Monk Centre and who is involved when the Monk Centre presented a draft of this bill, which became my bill to ban water exports. And I'll quote Mr. Saunders regarding what he said in committee in English.
That when you're talking about pipelines or canals, it is a gray area of international law. I assume the government is aware of that and is prepared to defend it under NAFTA. But certainly the argument can be made that the water has been captured by the pipeline, I would add, Mr. Speaker, when you put it into a pipeline. I take that point. Alors, on peut entrevoir
So we can imagine a day when a province decides to lift its moratorium and the province signs a contract with an American business person and both of them join forces to try and quash this provision of my colleague's bill. So that is a possibility, and so that is a flaw within the bill, Mr. Speaker.
The point that the member from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, has made on numerous occasions, that my bill, the bill that was voted on in this House and that was defeated by this government, the bill that was based on the work of the Monk Centre, the work of people like J. Owen Saunders, that somehow this bill was unconstitutional because it was infringing on provincial jurisdiction. But Mr. Speaker, that's not the case. And I asked Mr. Saunders that question in committee, and he was quite categorical on that point. You know, preventing massive diversions of water from one water basin in Canada to another is a matter of national concern and fits within peace, order, and good government. The peace, order, and good government provisions of our Constitution. So I really don't think that's a valid point. I think, yes, it would be a bigger challenge to work with the provinces on issues like this, but this is the kind of challenge that governments, that a federal government that really cares about our water security would would want to take up with the provinces. If you want to get anything done in this federation, which is a very complex federation, you have to have the courage to sit down with the provinces and work it out. But it's much easier to not do that and to pass something that is much more limited and that may have some holes in it, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker. Now, I was hoping that at committee, I was really hoping we could have more than one or two committee hearings on this issue. I was hoping that we could explore the issue of water exports within the context of NAFTA, because this is where the issue gets complicated, and this is why the honourable member has brought in this bill, and why I brought in my bill. It is because there is still a lot of dispute as to whether our fresh water in its natural state is protected from the rules of free trade that are under NAFTA. And it would have been good to explore that whole issue. It would have been very good to explore that whole issue in committee. And we might have drawn some conclusions about what more needs to be done to protect ourselves against the free trade provisions of NAFTA as they might apply to water. I would just say, Mr. Speaker, that if ever there's a dispute on this issue, and there's a tribunal that is struck, a Canada-U.S. tribunal under NAFTA that is struck, don't expect the Americans to come to that tribunal, the American members of that tribunal to take the same point of view we have about water not being part of NAFTA. In the United States, water in its natural state is a commodity, Mr. Speaker, and so we know where they stand on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to join the debate on Bill C-383, the Transboundary Waters Protection Act. First, I'd like to thank my colleague from Bruce Grey Owen Sound for bringing this important legislation forward. The support that this bill has received so far is a testament to his efforts and reflects the position of Canadians from all regions of this country about the need to protect Canada's waters. Bulk removals of water would pose a significant threat to Canada's environment. The protection of this resource is of vital importance to all Canadians. This is why, in 2008, our government made a commitment in the speech from the throne to put in place stronger protections to prevent the bulk removal of water. And this is why we introduced Bill C-26, which unfortunately died on the order paper with the 2011 election call. Now, thanks to the work of the member from Bruce Grey Owen Sound, we have this bill before us. The time has now come for this House to pass this legislation that will ensure Canadian waters are protected from bulk removals. I am glad to see that C-383 is supported by the government and by members of all parties. As my colleague mentioned, the Transboundary Waters Protection Act amends two acts, the International Boundaries Water Treaty Act and the International River Improvements Act. Amendments to the International Boundaries Water Treaty Act will prevent the bulk removal of water from Canadian transboundary waters, waters that flow across borders. Boundary waters that straddle the border, such as the Great Lakes, are already protected under the International Boundaries Water Treaty Act and its regulations. With the changes found in C-383, all of these waters under federal jurisdiction will be protected from the bulk removal of water to outside of the country. There are other elements found in Bill C-383 that strengthen protections against bulk removals. For example, proposed amendments to the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act would bring the enforcement authorities' fine scheme and sentencing provisions of the Act in line with those found in the Environmental Enforcement Act, which delivers on the government's commitment to bolster protection of water, air, land, and wildlife through more effective enforcement. Provisions found in C-383 amending the International Boundaries Water Treaty Act closely follow the regime from the Environmental Enforcement Act. In terms of the fine schemes, I must remind everyone again of these penalties. sentencing provisions and enforcement tools are available. These provisions include mandatory minimum fines for designated offences and increased maximum fines of all offences under prosecution and conviction. In addition to higher fines, the Act sets out fine ranges that vary according to the nature of the offences and the type of offender, such as individuals, small revenue corporations, and corporations. Each of these categories of offender faces stiff fines for violations. For example, individuals could face up to $1 million in fines, and a corporation up to $6 million for the first offence. For a second or subsequent offence, the applicable fine range will double. Fines for contravening the law are cumulative, meaning that a violation that continues for more than 1 day is seen as a separate offence for each day that it continues. Further to this, Mr. Speaker, the court must order an offender to pay additional fines if the court determines that the offender obtained any property, benefit or advantage from the commission of the offence. Courts also must consider increasing fines if the offence caused damage or risk of damage to the environment. As with the other federal environmental statutes that were amended through the Environmental Enforcement Act, this bill includes other provisions that would enhance the goals of deterrence, denunciation, and restoration that are the fundamental purpose of sentencing. This legislation contains provisions allowing for the publication of information about the commission of the offence and the punishment imposed, as well as provisions requiring the notification of corporation shareholders in the event of a conviction. The objective is to encourage compliance given the importance of public opinion on corporate success. So, Mr. Speaker, as we can see, this legislation provides strict consequences for violations of the Act. The goal is quite simple: to deter anyone from attempting to violate the bulk water removal prohibitions found in the Act. Bill C-383 also moves certain definitions and exceptions from the regulations of the International Boundaries Water Treaty Act into the Act itself. This will make it more difficult to change these definitions or exceptions at a later date and provides Parliament with a stronger oversight role should changes ever be considered. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to take a few minutes to speak about the provision in this bill that amends the International River Improvements Act. The purpose of the International River Improvements Act is to ensure that international rivers are developed and used in the national interest. International rivers are waters flowing from any place in Canada to any place outside Canada. The International Rivers Improvement Act requires proponents that would like to construct improvements such as dams, canals, obstructions, reservoirs, or other works that would significantly alter the flow or level of any international river at the international boundary to apply for a license. This Act follows the federal government to ensure that all such works are constructed and operated in a manner that complies with the Canada-U.S. Boundaries Treaty. Bill C-383 amends this Act to prevent the use of international rivers to transfer large quantities of water across the border. As mentioned in previous speeches and during committee consideration of this bill, some water experts see the use of international rivers as a potentially efficient pathway to transfer water in bulk. To prevent this from happening, Bill 383 amends the International River Improvements Act to prohibit licenses for the linking of waters wholly in Canada to international rivers, and then using those rivers to move water in bulk across the border. This amendment to the International Rivers Improvement Act adds another layer of protection against the bulk removal of water from Canada and was endorsed by experts from the Munk School on Global Affairs during the recent Standing Committee consideration of Bill C-383. Mr. Speaker, I would once again like to offer my thanks to the member from Bruce Grey Owen Sound for introducing this legislation. As we have seen, this bill is roundly supported by members of the House, and I urge all members to support this bill when it comes up for a vote. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak today to the bill introduced by the member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound. Our party intends to support the bill, and I want to congratulate my colleague on the opposite side of the House for having introduced it. But above all, I want to thank all of the people in Canada who have been pressuring the government for many years in order to protect our most precious resource, our water. As you know, Bill C-383 seeks to amend the International Boundary Waters Treaty in order to strengthen prohibitions with regard to bulk water removals and to improve current protections. The bill targets all boundary waters between Canada and the United States, water flowing from Canada to the United States, and water in rivers flowing towards the United States. This is, in my opinion, significant legislation that would help to protect our resources. As a member of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources, protecting water in Canada is important to me, and I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about the bill in order to address the positive elements as well as the limitations of the bill. First, I think it's important to stress the fact that in large part the bill introduced by the member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, is identical to the one that had been tabled by the Conservative government in 2010. A bill that had been introduced following promises made by the Conservatives in the throne speeches made in 2008 and 2009, promises to introduce legislation to prohibit bulk water transfers or exports from our watersheds. As my colleagues know, the bill introduced by the Conservatives was never passed because it never passed first reading. Obviously, it wasn't a priority for the government. If I talk about the similarities between this bill and the former bill, it is not only to talk about the Conservatives' inaction to date, but it's also because one of the positive aspects in the bill, the C-83, is that it fixes a major fault in C-26. The C-26 did not protect Canadian waters from its most serious threat, that is from transfers between watersheds that are neither along the borders or transboundary waters from Canada towards the United States. Bill C-83 proposes to amend the International River Improvements Act in order to prohibit the licensing of projects that would connect non-boundary waters to an international river where a project would seek to increase the flow towards the United States. A significant amendment that would help to prevent the issuing of licenses to construct, develop, or maintain a canal or aqueduct transporting Canadian waters to an international river. But like its predecessor, Bill C-383 includes a significant flaw. It does not prohibit all bulk water removals, and that is why the NDP believes that the bill must go further, that it must better protect our precious resource that is water. We support legislation that seeks to protect all groundwater in Canada, the implementation of a plan in cooperation with the provinces that seeks to implement a ban on bulk water removals, and the adoption of binational accords that would prevent the United States from taking unilateral action to import water. The NDP hopes in particular that the federal government will commit to countering the threats that NAFTA represents for Canada's water resource sovereignty. For those who do not know it, under NAFTA, Canadian water is both a service and an investment. NAFTA defines water as a product. Saying that water is a good can weaken or invalidate provincial and federal laws and regulations to protect our water. In this regard, the Council of Canadians reminds us of the worrying example of the Sunbelt Corporation Company in California. In 1990, Sunbelt reached an agreement with Canadian Snowcap Waters in order to export bulk water from British Columbia towards the United States. On March 18th, 1991, the government of British Columbia imposed a moratorium on water exports, a moratorium that was followed by the adoption by the provincial government of its Water Protection Act that prohibited water exports. After the passage of this legislation by British Columbia, Sunbelt undertook action against Canada under NAFTA provisions and demanded $10 billion in compensation. As far as I know, the case still has not been resolved. It is to deal with such threats that former NDP Member of Parliament Bill Blakey introduced a motion in 1999. This opposition motion led to a moratorium on bulk water removals. The motion was adopted by the House and made the government responsible for introducing legislation to prohibit bulk water exports and transfers between watersheds, and said that the federal government should not rely on any international agreements that would force us to export soft water against our will. The day after the passage of the motion, the Liberal government at the time announced a strategy to prohibit bulk water removals, including exports in major Canadian watersheds. But as was the case for many other major announcements made by the Liberals, that government took no concrete measures. I don't need to say that the NDP has not abandoned working to protect water. In 2007, the NDP, through my colleague, the member for Burnaby New Westminster, introduced a motion asking the government to undertake talks with American and Mexican counterparts in order to ensure that water was excluded from NAFTA. This motion was adopted in the House, but the government did not have serious discussions with these countries since that time that the motion was adopted. Still, in the interest of protecting Canadians, my colleague from Burnaby New Westminster did not give up the fight. In 2011, he came back proposing once again his motion on a national water strategy. It was motion 5, and it reads as follows: that, in the opinion of the House, the government should develop and present a comprehensive water policy based on public trust, which would specifically A, recognize that access to water is a fundamental right, B, recognize that the UN Economic and Social Council finding in General Comment 15 on the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights 2002, that access to clean water is a human right. C, prohibit bulk water exports and implement strict restrictions on new diversions. D, introduce legislation on national standards for safe, clean drinking water. E, implement a national investment strategy to enable municipalities and Aboriginal communities to upgrade desperately needed infrastructure without resorting to privatization through public-private partnerships. F, oppose measures in international agreements that promote the privatization of water services, and G, commit to ensure water does not become a tradable commodity in current and future trade deals. I want to congratulate my colleague from Burnaby, New Westminster, for demonstrating the type of concrete action that needs to be taken, and this should be able to become legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There remains 1 minute before the honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound has his 5-minute right of reply. Resuming debate. Pour 1 minute.
For 1 minute, the honourable member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, although I will focus on the risks of bulk water exports and the opposition of such a plan as an essential element in a national policy on water, I will talk about what is behind the concerns of the public with regard to the proliferation of economic activities that commercialize water resources, which are abundant in remote regions of the country. Now, Mr. Speaker, given the current political situation in the country and the situation with regard to mining development and economic development, as well as the fact that we're commercializing this resource, I want to say, and I hope that this will get through, that the rhetoric put forward today by the Conservative government will ensure that we will not commercialize water and attach a monetary value to it. And I hope that it will not be, in fact, to create an agenda to promote the current hoarding of the resource in order to later market it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate with his 5-minute right of reply, the honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm probably not going to take the whole 5 minutes on this wintry day in Ottawa and let everybody get out of here. But I do want to, my last chance to thank all the members for their past support on this bill. It's been unanimous support up to now, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certainly not taking anything for granted, but certainly hope that. And one thing that I have to point out with a couple of the members' comments today is they keep coming back and seem to want to interfere or go into provincial jurisdictions, and then on the next breath they admit that that would not probably be a very wise thing to do. And I will only speculate and leave you to speculate as to why they continue to do that. But this bill does what I wanted it to do, and I think what most Canadians wanted it to do. It doesn't cross boundaries, whether it's legal issues or provincial jurisdictions. And I think that that's the wise approach on this. And with that, I wish everyone a good weekend and would appreciate your support next Wednesday on third and final vote. Thank you very much.
With the completion of his right of reply, the time provided for this debate has expired. Accordingly, the question is as follows. Mr. Miller, seconded by Mr. Allison, moved that Bill C-383, an act to amend the International Boundaries Waters Treaties Act and the International River Improvements Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes? Yes? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yay. All those opposed will please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the recorded division stands deferred until Wednesday, February 13th, 2013, immediately before the time provided for private members' business. It being 1:52 p.m., this House stands adjourned until next Monday at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.